Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo les va? Yo soy Fabián Ibarburu. Nosotros en la CFA Society de Uruguay, eh, esto es una asociación sin fines de lucro afiliada al CFA Institute. Congregamos miembros que son alrededor de 120 analistas financieros, gestores de carteras y otros profesionales de la industria financiera. Todos nosotros contamos con la certificación CFA y muchos de los cuales nos están acompañando hoy. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos los miembros y algunos candidatos. La misión de la sociedad es promover la excelencia y la ética profesional en la industria financiera. Hay más de 200.000 shareholders en 164 países que tienen la misma misión y pasión, que es poner al cliente en primer lugar. En este espíritu organizamos este evento con el profesor Damodaran, que nos honra nuevamente con su presencia. En Uruguay promovemos nuestra marca. Buscamos que los mejores profesionales tomen el desafío de pasar estos 3 exámenes que se requieren para contar con el certificado. Que las instituciones financieras valoren que sus colaboradores cuenten con el CFA. Que los clientes confíen más en un profesional si es uno de nosotros. Que nuestra voz sea una referencia. Para eso organizamos este tipo de conferencias, tenemos un podcast, participamos en discusiones de políticas públicas y promovemos la educación financiera. Queremos expresar nuestro sincero agradecimiento a todos ustedes por dedicar una parte de la jornada laboral a enriquecer este encuentro. Entendemos nuestro reconocimiento a la Universidad Ort, a la Universidad de Montevideo, a la Universidad Católica y la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas y Administración de la Universidad de la República por su colaboración en la difusión de este evento. Y en el evento que viene en la tarde, en el cual van a estar participando estudiantes de estas universidades. Agradecemos también a nuestros patrocinadores, Schroders, MIG y Colchester, cuyo apoyo hace posible la realización de este tipo de eventos. Y agradecemos especialmente a la CAF y a su representante, en cabeza de su representante Miguel Hostos, por poder utilizar este gran auditorio para este evento. Esta actividad cuenta con 2 Professional Learning Credits que serán asignados automáticamente a aquellos que ya tengan el CFA. Estos créditos son una forma de mantener la certificación CFA vigente y actualizada. El doctor Damodaran no necesita mucha introducción, tiene una distinguida trayectoria como académico y gurú de la evaluación, tiene un doctorado en UCLA, actualmente enseña finanzas corporativas y evaluación en Stern School of Business de la Universidad de New York. Ha publicado muchos libros y muchos papers en su área de experiencia. Es reconocido internacionalmente por su contribución a la finanza. Son innumerables las referencias que en el mercado se hacen de sus lecciones y sus reflexiones. Hoy, junto al doctor Damodaran, hablaremos de las 2 palabras de moda. Arrancá ahí con la presentación, si querés. Inteligencia artificial. Exploraremos las lecciones que nos han dejado los cambios revolucionarios en décadas pasadas, desde la PC hasta la explosión de las redes sociales. Analizaremos las ilusiones y las desilusiones, la tendencia de los inversores a sobrevalorar empresas emblemáticas de estos cambios y cómo encontrar el valor intrínseco de las empresas que operan en el campo de la inteligencia artificial. Luego de la exposición tendremos un espacio para preguntas, pero todos los que quieran hacer preguntas durante la exposición también pueden hacerlo. Mr. Damodaran, the audience is yours.
Thank you. Let me get my... So I have no idea what the introduction was. I kind of tend to ignore it. So for all I know, he said some very insulting things, but I know he wouldn't do that now. But so I've learned to kind of roll with the punches. Yesterday was Brazilian Portuguese. I don't know a word of Brazilian Portuguese. I got introduced in Portuguese. I'm sure they said some very, you know what? I'll be quite honest. I think we all take ourselves way too seriously. Yeah. There's almost nothing in finance that's profound or significant. So the way I try to describe it is with 2 words. I'm a teacher who happens to do stuff on the side. Everything I do is an extension of teaching. I've never consulted a day in my life. I've never been an expert witness, and I've no desire to be one. I teach, that's all I do. The second is I'm a dabbler. People often ask me, what are you doing research on? I say, I don't do research, I dabble. You know what dabbling means? Whatever catches my fancy that week, I will think about, and then I move on. So over the course, if you look at my blog posts, they wander all over the place. Just in the last year, I valued Birkenstock, and I'll talk a little bit about Birkenstock. Any of you own a pair of Birkenstocks? They're pretty ugly sandals, but supposedly the people who wear them said they're the most comfortable sandals ever. They went public last September. And it's a fascinating story of how a 250-year-old German company that makes these ugly-looking sandals has now become not just a publicly traded company, but a name recognized around the world. I'm going to talk about it in the context of what are the values of intangibles. Accountants are fixated with this, and Birkenstock is full of intangibles. Last year I also said, I got interested in how sports teams get priced. Because you heard Mark Cuban sold the Dallas Mavericks, a team he's owned now for 20 years, for his share, he got $5 billion. And you look around the world, you see this with Manchester United, with Chelsea, and you also see it in sports players. Mbappe, what did they offer him? $1 billion to come to Saudi Arabia to play? So I was looking at sports and said, why are the zeros keep adding up? So I moved on and said, I'd like to think about why people pay what they do. And the answer is a very simple one. People don't buy sporting teams, soccer teams, football teams, because they want to own a business. They buy them as expensive toys. If you don't believe me, take a look at who owns sports teams now around the world. About 70% of the big sports franchises are owned by billionaires. Some are Russian, some are, I don't know where they get their money, but they have a lot of money, and they want an expensive plaything. Now, and this is a process that got started 7 years ago when the San Diego Clippers, at that time, they were the professional basketball team that played in San Diego, moved to LA. And Steve Ballmer, you know who Steve Ballmer is, right? CEO of Microsoft, he'd retired, and he paid $2 billion for the Clippers. And I tried to value the Clippers, and the most I could get was $800 million. I tried everything in my power. And then I said, that extra $1.2 billion is what he paid for an expensive toy. And then I put up a picture of Steve Ballmer on the sidelines. It's out there in Google of what he looks like when he's watching a Clippers game. And I said, have you ever seen him look like this at any of the Microsoft annual meetings? And the reality is, this is the most fun he's had in his entire life. I don't begrudge him. And along the way, there was no way for me to avoid the biggest buzz of all, which is right now AI. When did this become? 2 years ago, if I'd done this and I mentioned AI, I said, oh, it's interesting, some machine learning thing. How did this become part of everybody's consciousness? What triggered it? ChatGPT, it's actually very interesting. It was this low-tech AI. ChatGPT is low-tech AI. Suddenly, it was in everybody's consciousness. Here's how I heard about it. My wife, who teaches 5th grade, came home one day about a year ago, and she said, my students are answering stuff using ChatGPT. We need to find some way to kind of catch them when they do it. And then a couple of months later, my students in my regular class were not showing up at office hours. And a few of the students who used to show up, and I said, what are you doing? And they said, we're asking ChatGPT, how would Damodaran answer this question? And 2 weeks ago, I got the final wake-up call that this is here to stay. It's not affecting just business, it's going to affect us. Friend of mine who teaches at NYU, he teaches machine learning, so he's in that space. Now, called me a couple of weeks ago and said, we built a Damodaran bot. I said, what? He said, we built an AI, and it's read every one of your blog posts ever written. I have 2,500 pages of blog posts, every evaluation you've ever done, and we're ready to try it out. And I said, what exactly do you want me to do? And he said, we'd like 20 students from your class. They'll value a company. The Damodaran bot will value the company, and we're going to see how well the bot does. I'm terrified of either outcome. If it does really well, what's the message I'm getting? I'm done. Might as well retire. Let the Damodaran bot teach my classes, do all the valuations. If it does really badly, there's another message, which is my blogs are not delivering the learning I hope they thought it would. So, but I'm interested because that experiment is out, and that's an experiment that is happening in each of your lives, even if you don't know it. It might not be your name in front of the bot, but there is this unnamed bot that's trying to do what you're doing in your job. And guess what? It's getting awfully close to replicating you. So this is as much a personal exploration of AI and where it's going. But the way I'm going to structure it, rather than jump into AI and talk about its consequences, I'm going to go back in time. One of the few advantages of growing old is you gain perspective. I did my first valuation in 1981. How many of you were not born in 1981? Okay, a lot of you, right? You know what I used to do my first valuation? A ledger sheet. Most of you have never seen a ledger sheet. A ledger sheet is just a blank sheet of paper with lines drawn through it. The innovation was the lines were drawn. I could never get the lines straight. The ledger sheet, the lines came drawn. This is great. A pencil, never a pen. I learned that very early. When you do a ledger sheet, you enter things in pen. You got to scratch things out. A pencil and a calculator. Not an abacus. I'm not that old, but no. And I did my first. 1 year later, you saw the very first primitive personal computers come in. Did it change the way we live, we work? Absolutely. I can't even imagine my kids can't even imagine the world without the internet. But I asked them to imagine a world without computers. They said, what did you guys do, live in caves? But that wasn't that long ago. It is, in my lifetime, the first big disruption we saw were personal computers, and that effectively took us through the 1980s, changed the way we work, changed the way we live, changed the way we interact with each other. I have trouble writing now because I'm so unused to writing. I type everything. So every one of these disruptions creates something, but we'll start to lose some skills as human beings we used to have. And with each of these disruptions, I want you to think about what we've lost with that disruption, because it's going to set us up for what will AI do for us? And as a consequence, what will we stop learning how to do as human beings? No? And I'll give you a very simple, explicit example. I can no longer read a map. Why? Because GPS does it for you, right? Go right, go left. I'm so used to it. I don't think I can find my way home from 3 blocks away without my GPS. Go right, go left. No, I've completely lost my sense of direction. We've spent thousands of years of evolution developing these skills. 10 years, we wiped them out. So that was the first big disruption. The second one happened in the 1990s. If I close my eyes, I'm not going to try to do it now because I might fall asleep. I've had a couple of short nights of sleep. I won't close my eyes, but imagine that I close my eyes. I can still remember that phone beep that AOL used to do before you connected. Again, if you're old enough, you remember, right? You connected, then you hit the boop, 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 and then you're connected. And you say, great. And of course, things moved so you couldn't send big files, like it's a tiny little bandwidth. But the internet, the 1990s, huge change again. Again, not just businesses, but the way we live. I talk to my kids about travel agencies. Remember those used to exist, these offices with people sitting behind big terminals, and you'd walk in and say, I want to fly from Montevideo to Miami, and the travel agent would very secretively look at that terminal and could click things in. I found the right flight for you. It's the cheapest you can get. You have no idea whether it's the cheapest, but you have to trust the person behind the terminal because you can't access it. The internet changed the way, again, we live, we interact. Second big disruption, changes the way we work, changes the way we live. And then you get to the first decade of the century, and you have the smartphone. I know BlackBerries exist in the 1990s, but that was a business geeky thing, right? You went around, people had BlackBerry thumb. But the smartphone I'm talking about is the very first generation of the iPhone. I've saved my very first iPhone. Remind me that when I complain about how little memory I have on my iPhone 12, I should take a look at my iPhone 1 to see how little I used to have then. Has the smartphone changed the way you live? Can you live without your smartphone, you think? I mean, your lives are in there, right? You don't even remember your name. You know, what, let me check on my smartphone. Tell me what, you know. Your calendar is there. It basically runs your life. That's why when the phone dies, what's the first thing you do? You drop everything. You could be in the middle of the most important. So I've got to go plug my phone in, because if it's dead, then I can't get home tonight. The smartphone changed the way we live, and think about all the businesses that exist only because of smart. Do you have Uber in Montevideo? Yeah? Can you imagine Uber without a smartphone? You'd have to go out of the building and say, Uber! Yell as loud as you can. Maybe somebody will hear you. There would be no ride sharing without the smartphone. Do you have DoorDash? Or something equivalent where people do. Yeah, so I think every company that came in this last decade should pay a royalty to the smartphone companies, because without them, there would be no businesses. Huge shift. It happened over time, so you don't even realize what life looked like in 2002 before the smartphone. And then you get to the last decade, it's social media explode. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram in the later part of the decade. I just came out of Brazil. And as you know, social media is creating waves that are not just waves in business, but waves in politics. Elon Musk is basically at war with Brazil. I don't know who will win, but this is a social media. Again, a huge change in the way we interact, the way we get information. What I'm going to do is actually take those 4 big disruptions, look at what they created as change, because there is a lesson there. Because right now, what are people telling you about AI? It's going to be amazing. Where markets are going to go up because of AI. Every company that I talk to, our costs will be lower because of AI. I heard that with the PCs. I heard that with the internet. I heard that with smartphones. And it turns out that those promises don't quite get delivered. So I want to talk about what the world will look like 10 years from now, assuming AI. I mean, the reason we have to assume it is, remember, like, you know, there's the old saying that markets have predicted 10 of the last 3 recessions. Yeah? What that means is markets often predict a recession, it doesn't happen. Predict a recession, markets have predicted 10 of the last 4 disruptions. So all too often you'll see a workshop, this is going to be disruption. 3 years you look back and say, wasn't much. Just in the last decade, the cloud business took off. People said, this is going to disrupt the world. I never quite bought into it because it didn't percolate into my personal life. I might have saved a file on the cloud, but and then the metaverse completely befuddled me. For a brief period, people thought, metaverse. When I hear the word metaverse, I think of, it tells you how old I am, I think of SimCity on steroids. Right? That's basically metaverse. You live in a virtual world. You have a virtual house, you have a virtual spouse, you have virtual kids, you send them off to virtual college. You probably never leave your house. That doesn't sound like a fun life. But I never thought the metaverse would have roots but with AI, I'm going to talk about what we're seeing around us, because this is the first change I've heard in quite a while where you say this could be the next big thing. So let's start by looking at what it is that brought it to consciousness and how it's played out. So ChatGPT brings AI to the surface. And as it comes to the surface, all of a sudden you see it percolate through markets. And the biggest winner, so far at least, from the AI explosion is NVIDIA. Somebody want to tell me what NVIDIA does in AI that's made them the first winner in the space? What does it do? Chips, right? First, do you know whether, so what does NVIDIA do with it? Does it make the chips? It actually doesn't make chips. It designs the chips. You know who makes the chips? TSMC makes the chips. NVIDIA is a design company. And you say, why is it there's so many chip companies. What makes NVIDIA special? Does anybody know what makes NVIDIA the winner so far in the AI space? I'm sorry? But that was a different market. So they got that market, but the AI chip is very different from the crypto chip or the gaming chip, which are two other markets that NVIDIA. First, NVIDIA started working on the AI chip in 2020, before other people were even thinking about AI. They were the first person, and this is not the first time they've done it. So when I value NVIDIA, I'm going to call them my opportunistic chip company. They seem to find a way to get into these big markets before people even realize they're big markets. They got into gaming, they got into crypto, now into AI. First time, you can say they got lucky. The second time, really lucky. And the third time, say there's something systematic in the company that's letting them get ahead. Their chips are designed for AI. If you think about AI, AI is actually a culmination of two big trends over the last 15 years. One is data. Data on what? Not just numbers, but data on the choices and decisions each of us makes every day. You know what? When people complain about the loss of privacy, the question I have is, who gave away your privacy? You did. In return for what? Convenience. I talked about GPS. I use GPS all the time, but to use GPS, what do you have to turn on first? You have to turn on location, otherwise Google Maps won't work, Apple Maps. So in return for free, because remember the old days you had to buy a Garmin or whatever it was and put it in the car? You get it free. You think there's an old saying in Silicon Valley, if something is free, you're the product, right? So in return for that, I have to give up location. So over the last 15 years, we've managed to get more and more data. So that's a first trend, and it's been happening for a while. The second is that computers are getting more and more powerful. AI is just the combination of data and powerful processing. So it's not as if it happened just 2 years ago. This has been happening incrementally. Finally, we have a name on it. We might have called it machine learning before this, but we have a name on it. So when you look at NVIDIA, it exploded. And in terms of how much it exploded, let me give you some perspective, right? It's now a $2 trillion company, $2 trillion company. NVIDIA alone is worth more than all of the other semiconductor companies put together. It is the fourth largest company in the world in terms of market cap. And it was nowhere 5 years ago. So you can see the explosion in value. So if you think about first order effects, AI gets talked about, NVIDIA goes up. And if you think in terms of analogs, in the internet business, one of the first companies to kind of explode out of the box was a company called Cisco. You know what Cisco did? It created routing, it created the architecture for the internet. And in every one of these booms, the architecture companies are always the ones that initially benefit because you can see it, it's tangible. But along the way, you've also had second order effects. Microsoft has gone up about 40% in the last 6 months and about 100% over the last year and a half. So why does Microsoft get into the AI game? What is it about Microsoft? You can't say it's all tech companies because Google hasn't done it and the other companies have all been. So what is it that Microsoft did that's made them this second order beneficiary? They entered into a partnership with this very strange nonprofit called OpenAI. The reason I call it a very strange nonprofit is if I ask you what the value of a nonprofit is, what's the answer? What's the value? It's zero, right? If you have no profits, what the heck am I paying for? How the heck do you have a nonprofit that people say is worth 90 billion? One of those has to be a lie. And I think it's a nonprofit that's a lie. The only problem is they have a board of directors that still operates under the delusion that they're a nonprofit. And you saw this play out last year in one of the strangest episodes I've ever seen of corporate governance. What did they do? They fired Sam Altman because he was being too commercial. $90 billion entity. Of course I've got to be commercial. I've got to raise capital. You knew this wasn't going to end well. So they tried to fire Sam Altman, and by the end of the process, Sam Altman fired them. But this was pure chance, right? Microsoft, when it formed the partnership with OpenAI, did not realize the explosion that was coming. And you're going to see this happen in businesses, that sometimes winning is a function of being at the right place at the right time. Microsoft happened to be at the right place at the right time. ChatGPT got on, and Microsoft has benefited. If you look at the title for the session, it says winners, losers, and wannabes. Will there be winners from this AI? Absolutely, we're already seeing some. Will there be losers from this? Every single one of the disruptions I've talked about has created losers, right? I'm going to call this the dark side of disruption. For every Uber, there are 100 taxi cab companies that have gone under. Don't think this will be painless. AI advocates talk about how great this is going to be, and for some people it's going to be great, but there's going to be a lot of pain along the way. And hopefully you won't be in the heart of the pain. You've got to figure a way to be on the right side of the divide, but there will be pain along the way. And then there are wannabes. Every one of these movements has wannabes. What do? They talk about it even though it has absolutely no effect on their value and no real change. Last year, a company called Kroger. You know what Kroger does? It's a grocery store chain. It's one of the biggest grocery stores. It is the biggest standalone grocery store chain in the US. The Walmart actually sells more groceries. Kroger is only groceries. Their earnings report mentioned AI 13 times. My reaction is, what exactly is AI going to do for you? When I walk in, is it going to lead me to the lettuce? Is it going to do my shopping for me? Is it going to tell me what to eat? The answer is, for a grocery store, AI is irrelevant. But why do they talk about it? Because they know that this is a buzzword of the moment. You throw it in, people are going to get excited. At least that's what they hope. There are going to be a lot of wannabes in this process. And you and I have to learn to discriminate between the people who will be affected positively or negatively and the 95% that are going to be wannabes. So let's get this process on the way with a very quick review of intrinsic value. Because we're going to talk about what will AI do, we need to understand where will it play out. Now, as you know, I teach valuation. I start every class with, what is intrinsic value? Intrinsic value, cut down to basics, basically says the value of an asset comes from its cash flows, its growth, its risk. That's it. This isn't new, right? People have known this for as long as time. That Venetian glassmaker in the 1500s who sold his business based it on cash flows, growth, and risk. What we've done in the last century, of course, is we brought the power of, coming up with a way of, computing that risk effect, maybe add a risk and return model, and maybe have tools to estimate the cash flows better. And then we slapped a name on it, discounted cash flow valuation, or in its short form, DCF. I'm terrified when people say, I've done a DCF. I have this section called a Hall of Shame for DCFs, because there are 99 terrible ways to do DCFs. And people seem to find a way to get to those 99. Right? Because the way the title of the session I usually, just because you have a CF and a D doesn't mean you have a DCF. Because lots of different ways you can do it, and lots of bad ways of doing it. But at its core, if you think about it, in a discounted cash flow valuation, the value of an asset is the expected cash flows on that asset discounted back. That's what discounted cash flow is, nothing more, nothing less. So when people say, I know how to do a DCF, people have always known this isn't rocket science. So when you think about a DCF, the most common way in which you see discounted cash flows done is you take the expected cash flows. Key is expected, right? Which means you've got to think good outcomes, bad outcomes, it's all going to be in there, and discount them back at a risk-adjusted discount rate. We can dance around the risk adjustment, but ultimately that is a first principle. Whether you use betas to get there or something else, I really don't care, because if you follow the first principles, we're 90% of the way together. That's the way you normally see DCF. There is another version that you might not see as much, but the second way to do DCFs. Instead of using expected cash flows, you can use what are called certainty equivalent cash flows. So what the heck are those? I don't know whether you've ever seen this TV show called Let's Make a Deal. Okay? It's a show where this guy, Howie Mandel, runs the show. I'll take you into the show. Here's how the show works. There are two suitcases on the top. One has $1 million, the other has nothing. Howie calls up the contestant. So, you want to be my contestant? So you're coming up to the top. You don't have to come up. You can sit there and laugh. No, I don't want you to fall and hurt yourself or something. So there are two suitcases, $1 million and 0. And I offer you guaranteed cash to walk away from that bet. So how much would you ask for in return for walking away from that bet? Would you really? No, so you won't settle for 450? Really? You would settle for, tell me why. Because if you get 450, you got cash in the hand. If you go for the bet, there's a 50% chance you get nothing, right? Well, you know what the essence of risk aversion is? You never pay expected value, because if there's risk involved, you pay. That's why we do risk-adjusted cash flows, right? We know for 400 years, the first guy who ran this experiment was an Italian called Daniel Bernoulli. And he ran this experiment with real people, and he noticed people were not paying the expected value, and hence was born risk aversion in economics and all the utility functions in emerged from it. So how much would you settle for? Would you settle for 400? Huh? And what is it going to be a function of? How risk averse? The more risk averse you are as a person, the less you'll settle for, right? Because it's guaranteed. I watched that show. I watch a lot of TV. I don't read, and as a too intellectual, I just watch TV. In Netflix, actually, so many bad shows. I just watch how many bad shows I can get in a day. So I watched the show, Let's Make a Deal. I've never seen anybody accept the expected, go for the expected. Some will take 450, 460, 350, 3. I've seen one person walk away with 150,000 rather than take that bet between the two. It's not right or wrong, it's a function of risk aversion. You're saying, how can I do valuation with a game show? Let's suppose you wanted to value NVIDIA. I value it. So I have the expected cash flows in NVIDIA, right? That good time, bad time. So think of that as equivalent of that bet. What if you could take each cash flow in year one is $10, and say, look, I'll take $8 guaranteed instead of that $10. And each year I gave you this bet. It's going to be a nightmare to do this with every cash flow, but if you played along, you could replace your expected cash flows with what are called certainty equivalent cash flows. Once you get that, you can actually discount at the risk-free rate because your cash flows are now risk-adjusted. I have never seen anybody do this right, but there are actually variants of this that get done, right? One of the problems with teaching a valuation class is Warren Buffett. I'll repeat it again. One of the problems with teaching a valuation class is Warren Buffett. The reason I call him a problem is he often says things off the cuff that people take as religious edicts. So one of the things Warren has said, and he's been open about it, is he doesn't like betas. Okay. And he said he uses the T-bond rate as his discount rate. And those people end up in my class, and I do a risk-adjusted discount. Say, no, but Warren Buffett doesn't adjust the discount rate, he uses the risk-free rate. I said, have you seen what he discounts back at the risk-free rate? You know what the Buffett view is, right? You count only those earnings that you feel sure about, which is kind of an intuitive version of certainty equivalent. Say, look, you might make $1 million, but only 600,000 can be. So think of that as kind of a lower tech version of certainty equivalence. And one of the reasons I often push back when people say, I value a company, because every person in my class has to value a company. They'll say, I use conservative estimates of cash flows. My reactions don't do that. Because you know what's going to happen then, right? You use conservative estimates, that's like adjust, and then they will use a risk-adjusted discount rate on these conservative cash flows. What the heck do I do with that number? Do the expected cash flows, tell me how uncertain you are, and we can talk, but if you replace it with some conservative estimate, I'm neither here nor there. I can't act on it. So that is at the core of discounted cash flow valuation. So, I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm going back here. So that's it. So I value companies on my blog, and let me tell you, I value companies with an audience of what? There's only one person I have to keep happy with my valuations, and luckily it's me. And I like myself, so I don't get too hard on that. And I make that point, look, I am not valuing NVIDIA for you, I'm valuing it for myself. I will act on my NVIDIA valuation. Don't bitch and moan about what you don't like about my NVIDIA valuation. I'll give you the spreadsheet with all the levers, and you think my growth rate is too low, use a higher growth rate, come up with a value, make your own decisions. It's your money, not mine. But notwithstanding that message that I repeatedly deliver, people will take issue. And a company that I value every year, and it's like walking into the storm every time I do it, is Tesla. You value Tesla. You're going to get heat from both sides because this is a company that you either love or hate. You think it's worth nothing because you think Elon Musk is a scam artist, or you think it's worth trillions because he's the greatest man to ever walk the face of the earth. So no matter what value I get, I'll hear from both sides. And most of them will not say, I'll use too low growth rate, too high a growth rate. I know I've done something right if I get equal percentages from both sides. Okay, this is good. I'm right in the middle here. But then somewhere along the way, just to throw in an insult, they say, yeah, but you're a valuation theorist. I have to laugh because I know how little theory there is in my class. This is it. This is the entire theory of my class. One equation. You know what I spent 26 sessions doing? Finessing the expected cash flows and coming up with better ways of adjusting the discount rate. Bernardo's in my valuation certificate class. He just took the third quiz today that I gave. And he can tell you, even after that first class, everything else is just icing on the cake. It's just, there's no theory. It's all practice. So I'm going to use this equation to draw out 4 propositions about valuation that I want you to keep in mind. The first proposition is what I call the it proposition. Let me state it's going to sound absurd, but hang in there. Here's what the it proposition says. If it does not affect the cash flows and it does not affect risk, let's stop talking about it. You know how many things we talk about a company? Say, why are you talking about this? It is my ultimate load for, hey, should this matter? So let's throw a few its at you, and you tell me where it shows up in the cash flows, the risk, and if it doesn't, maybe you should stop talking about it. Brand name. Marketing people just do somersaults. You mentioned it, oh my amazing brand name. Where does brand name show up in your valuation? Bernardo? What does brand name allow you to do? Sell the same product as your competitors and charge a higher price, right? That's basically brand name. You walk into a pharmacy, I don't know whether this is true here, but no, I walk into a pharmacy in the US and I want to buy Sudafed for my allergies. I can buy Sudafed, the original, and right next to it, because it's off patent, I can buy the generic version of Sudafed, and every single time the generic version is cheaper, but I find myself reaching for the brand name. Why? Because psychologically, I seem to stop sneezing sooner. It's completely in your brain, okay? But it's an incredibly strong power. So you know where it shows up? Higher margins. In fact, in the Birkenstock case, the reason it fascinated me was, one, the brand name. And there's an interesting stop here. How did Birkenstock acquire that brand name? How did it become one of the most recognized names in the world? Even in people who are not even tempted to buy a Birkenstock know the name. What are some of the things that caused it? Until 1965, Birkenstock was sold only in Germany and through people who had foot problems. So basically, they would sell it to these places where people go to sanitarium, have a foot problem, Birkenstocks. 1965, German-American goes back to Germany, and summer she has foot problems, she wears Birkenstock, she says, this is amazing. She goes to the owner of Birkenstock, say, would it be okay if I took this back to the US and tried to sell it at a store in LA? He initially didn't want to. He's German. He said, why would I want Americans wearing my shoes? Because they pay. And finally, he takes it back to an LA store. And then this is how brand name, then an accident of history happens, which is the hippies decided that Birkenstock was going to be their signal to the world of how little they thought about the establishment. Think about 1960s, everybody wore suits. I mean, you see pictures of baseball games, people wear suits and dress shoes. And you're a hippie, you say, I'm not going to wear dress shoes. That makes me like my dad or my mom. I'm going to wear Birkenstock. If you go look at pictures of Woodstock, Woodstock was a muddy mess. It's upstate New York. And you'll see people wearing Birkenstock. Couldn't have been comfortable sloshing through the mud. But the first building block for brand name came from this accident in history. Birkenstock didn't pay the hippies. The hippies just took it on. And then it went into hibernation for about a decade because the hippies became unhip and actually had to get jobs and wear shoes, wear suits. So that transition happened. And in 1991, Kate Moss, you know who Kate Moss is, right? One of the most famous models in the world, at the age of 16, was on the cover of Vogue, and she wore Birkenstock for the interview. I don't know what possessed her. But Birkenstock didn't pay. She just decided, this is comfortable. Maybe she had foot problems, for all I know. And that Vogue cover created a second surge for Birkenstock on campuses around the US. I remember teaching at Berkeley, people would be wearing Birkenstocks. Because that's what cool kids did. Second surge. What I'm trying to say is people think brand name is created by advertising and by having great marketing people. You'd be amazed at how often brand name is created by being at the right place at the right time and through accidents in history, pure luck. But by the time I valued Birkenstock, it had a significant brand name. How do you test when every company claims to have a brand name, right? How do you check to see whether that brand name assertion holds water? Where do we say brand name shows up? In your margins, right? If I compare your margins, they're lower than the industry average, I'm going to ask you to shut up about brand name and say, you really don't have a brand name. I don't care what you think about yourself, but nobody else cares. In the case of Birkenstock, their margins were 23%. The typical high-end footwear company had margins of 14%. So in my valuation, I let them have 23% margins. I'm building in brand name into my valuation. The second big intangible in Birkenstock was until 2012, it remained a family-run company. The original cobbler who created it in the 1700s in Germany, his family had gone through generations. And you know what happens to families as they go through generations? Each generation turns out to be a little lazier and a little less efficient than the previous one. And they did a critical mass of inefficient family management. And they did the right thing. The family actually hired an outside manager. And they got lucky. They hired this guy who actually understood what makes Birkenstock tick, which is a very unique brand name, where you don't pay people. The minute you start to pay people for this, then you're paying these YouTube celebrities to wave their feet in front. And he said, no, I'm not going there. We're special. And he, over the next decade, managed to bring growth back from low single digits to 20% growth. They're still running the company. They're going public. So in my valuation, I put in a higher growth rate for the next 5 years because the management is still going to be around. So I've got the great management in, the ed proposition. And there's a third thing that happened in the summer leading into the IPO. So again, an accident. The Barbie movie came out in the movie theaters. You say, what's the link between a Barbie movie and Birkenstock? Go back and watch the movie. You know what Barbie wears in the movie? Pink Birkenstock. There's a reason to rewatch the movie again, right? You know, Birkenstock sales jumped 30% last summer because of the Barbie movie. I called it the Barbie buzz. Is it an intangible? Yes. Does it have effects? Yes, because it shows up as higher revenues. Will it last? You know, the way movies are 2 years from now, you got to get Oppenheimer to wear Birkenstock and it doesn't look right. So in a sense, this is going to fade. So in my valuation, I gave them a jump in revenues for the first year saying there's a Birkenstock buzz. Three hits in there, and they're in the cash flows. But you know what this proposition is best for? To separate what matters from what doesn't. As many of you know, I love ESG. Not. Okay. Yeah. I think it's the most toxic, empty concept. That's kind of tough to bring. Usually if you're empty, you can't be toxic. If you're toxic, you can't be empty. ESG managed to pull off that trick. It's both toxic and empty. But in 2019, when I first wrote about ESG, I had an open mind. And I'd heard this guy, Larry Fink, who I thought knew what he was talking about. You know why? Because he probably manages some of your money, $11 trillion, one way or the other. It ends up in a BlackRock fund. Turns out in hindsight, he doesn't know what he's talking about, but he acted like he did. In 2019, what was he saying? He got up there and said, ESG is good for value. And my reaction is, really? To be good for value, what does it have to do? It has to either show up in the cash flows or show up in risk. So here's what I did. I took every paper written on ESG, and they're horrifically bad across the board. I mean, if you think academic research is bad, ESG academic research is beyond bad. Okay? So if any of you have written an ESG paper, please don't tell me. Okay? I would try to wipe it out. In fact, last year I got in trouble with the CFA. And I'm going to ask a question. I hope nobody here raises their hand. Do any of you have that CFA, you really paid them the money for that 100 multiple choice question? 80% of which are completely wrong and made up? Okay. You know how it showed up on my radar? Now, one of the questions, the multiple, it's actually unlike the rest of the ESG, which is you have to read thousands of pages, ESG certification, you could just show up for the exam. And if you think like an ESG person, which means you got to think shallow, you can't think too deep, you can coast through the 100. So one of the questions actually is, good ESG companies have lower costs of capital, true or false? The answer, according to the CFA, was, it's true. And so somebody said, is this true? And I said, not in this universe, and I can give you the data to back it up. You go to Refinitiv, you can download the ESG score for every company, you can download the cost of capital. I actually looked at a matrix of what is your, and there is zero link between ESG and cost of capital. So there's no risk effect. So maybe there's a cash flow effect. Maybe revenue growth is higher for companies with good ESG. Turns out that if you want a high ESG score, you actually have to cap your revenue growth. And I'll give you an example. The company that often gets used as a good ESG company, a company called Patagonia. What does Patagonia do? Make overpriced outerwear for guilty yuppies. That's basically it. That's its business model. $450 certificates for people who feel guilty about the world. We wear Patagonia. I've saved the world. Oh, was that easy? Okay. But you know how much Patagonia has as revenues? $1 billion. $1 billion company can afford to be a niche business, boast about the fact that they're a good company. You know how much Nike has as revenues? $40 billion. Nike can't afford to play these games. Imagine Nike saying, we don't like what's happening in China. We're not going to sell Nikes to the Chinese. You're not going to pull that off, because that could be 25% of your revenues. So in revenue growth, it turns out I look across, and I looked at the research, people weren't even asked, but I looked across companies. It's not only there's no relationship, it's actually a negative relationship. Going for a higher ESG score often put a cap on revenue growth, so it's not there. So maybe margins are higher for ESG companies. And there are actually a lot of papers that claim that profit margins are higher for ESG companies. Maybe that's another multiple choice question that got thrown in the CFA. And at first sight, I'm not picking on you, I'm just picking on the CFA, right? I would ask for my money back, to be quite honest. But at first sight, when you look at ESG scores, it turns out that high ESG companies have higher margins. Looks like, this is good, right? But then you take a look at why. For the bulk of the last decade, you know what kinds of companies had high ESG scores, right? If you're ExxonMobil, you could try as hard as you could, but your ESG score was in the toilet. Why? You were evil. You're a fossil fuel company. For the bulk of the decade, the companies that had the highest ESG scores were tech companies. You see what this is going to do, right? If I do research from 2011 through 20, what am I going to find? High ESG scores companies have high margins. High ESG score companies deliver positive alphas. I call these accidental alphas. It's not ESG that created the alphas, it's the fact that you skewed towards tech companies. Again, it's amazing how much research in this area forgets basic statistics. No? And the analogy I offer is, what if I told you that shopping at Whole Foods will make you richer? I could give you the statistics to back it up. You know, the correlation in how much money you spend at Whole Foods and how wealthy you are is incredibly high. It's a big positive number. But what's wrong with that assertion? It's because you're wealthy you shop at Whole Foods, not the other way around. ESG is contaminated to the core because of the way it's skewed. So I went item by item, and my bottom line is, I can't see the effect on value. Larry Fink might, but it's not there. So my reaction was, I don't want to talk about ESG anymore. This is wasting my time. That I lost that, no, because I kept coming back because, you know, it pissed me off enough that I had to write about it more and more. No. So I've done my 4th round, and I think I'm done now. I started off a little confused. That was my starting point. My 2nd round, I was concerned because I was seeing all these. 3rd round, I was cynical. This looked very much like a gravy train where a lot of people were selling it because they could make a lot of money. And now I'm beyond that. I mean, I guess contempt would be the right word to use as to where it is now, because it's really, I mean, you look at entities that adopt ESG, it eats away at your insights. McKinsey. 5 years ago, students would come and say, should I go work for Goldman Sachs or should I work for McKinsey? And my advice is, go work for McKinsey. There's more substance there. It's a good place. They talk about things of substance. In the last 5 years, it's amazing how, I mean, the way you can see it is the McKinsey Quarterly is their vehicle to talk about what they are doing internally. And I used to read the McKinsey Quarterly. I don't even try anymore. It just pisses me off. They just make up crap. Look, an article will be 10 ways ESG might make you a more valuable company. You know what? I could replace ESG with a fat CEO and say, 10 ways a fat CEO could increase the value of your company. I'm just making up stuff, right? Tell story after story. So last year, actually, it was some CFA in Florida has a podcast. I forget his name, and I do so many podcasts, I forget the names I'm even talking to. So he said, what do you think about this CFA ESG certificate? And I told him, I mean, I've reached the point where I've lost the censoring mechanism. I just say what's on my mind. I said, the most feckless thing I've ever seen. I love that word, feckless. Look it up if you want. But it's a perfect description. Oh, you know why they introduced the certificate, right? It's money to be made, easy money to be made. But in the process, my fear is you're eating away at your franchise. The reason I used to tell people, take a CFA rather than an MBA is, you got to actually get your hands dirty doing stuff with CFA that you don't do in an MBA program. And here you are introducing a certificate with 100 multiple choice questions, most of which you got the answer wrong on. This, I mean, it is what it is. So, I don't want to end up spending the rest of the day on ESG. The second proposition is what I call a don't be a wuss proposition. Let me explain. As I said, every person in my class is to value a company. About 30% of the people, about usually engineers, number-oriented people, about 3 or 4 weeks in will come in and say, look, I can't value this company. I say, why not? So much uncertainty. They say, what exactly did you think you would be able to do in a valuation? That if you value a company, an Argentine company, that the uncertainty in Argentina would go away. If it were that easy, Javier Milei would be running spreadsheets, right? There, I made the uncertainty go away. The problem is uncertainty is a feature, not a bug. We live in a world where you have 2 wars going on. You got countries melting down. You got political risk coming down the pike. What exactly do you expect to do? you cannot use the excuse of too much uncertainty. It is there. You make the best estimates you can, and then they'll say, how do I know I'm right? I say, I'll save you the trouble. You're definitely wrong 100% of the time. So then why bother? Because if you want to invest, you got to live with uncertainty. I'll tell you what you can do. You can move to Uruguay and buy fixed, I mean, everybody here seems to invest in fixed income things. So maybe this is where you need to move if you don't want to deal with uncertainty. No? But if you want to invest in the world we're in with all the stuff going on around us, you have to live with uncertainty. You have to make the best estimates. So don't be a wuss. Don't say, I have too much uncertainty. You think you're special? Everybody has uncertainty about what NVIDIA will do over the next decade. You got to do the best you can with the data you have and the tools you have. The third proposition is what I call my duh proposition, named after my daughter, who's approaching middle age, and I can't wait for her to turn 30. She's looking at this. She turns 30 next year. You'd think that the world was going to end next year. Every time I say, I'm going to turn 30. As if, no, I tell her, look, there's stuff happening after 30. You'll be okay. You'll be just middle-aged. She said, I'll be middle-aged? So the worst things coming down the pike. Enjoy middle age, because after middle age comes old age, and after old age comes all kinds of other stuff you don't want to know about. But when she was younger, her response to any comment I made was, Dad, duh. The amount of contempt that oozes out of the duhs, I stopped talking for a while. I reserve the duh proposition for a very special subset of companies that I value. These are companies with broken business models where there's zero chance of that broken business model ever being fixed. 5 years ago, a company called WeWork filed a prospectus to go public. I'd seen their building, so I said, no, I've heard the buzz, and so I decided to value the company. What does WeWork do? Compress. I mean, one of the things I think we all need to think about in valuation is think of a way of compressing a company's story into, without using buzzwords, into a sentence. What does WeWork do as a company? What's their business model? Workspace is what they rent out, but how do they get the workspace to rent out? They lease a building for 40 years, and then they sublease that building for 3 months, 6 months. The big selling point is the kombucha comes out of the wall. So they do all the stuff that 25 to 35-year-olds like, right? Kombucha on the walls, as you know, this you can windows you look out. No, but the basic theme is you've got you know why this model is, so when I looked at it, I said, this is not going to work. You got a duration mismatch born in hell. You take a 40-year building, you lease it out for 3 months, you're one recession away from going under, right? Because you have a recession, what happens? All your sublessors leave, you still have the building. So it's a 350-page prospectus, and I kept looking and looking. They must talk somewhere about the duration problem. No mention of it, which either means that they don't think there's a duration problem, which is a serious problem itself, or they know there's a duration problem and they don't want to talk about it. Either way, it's not good news. I struggled. I tried to find a pathway to make, and finally I gave up. I said, this is a broken business model. I said, what about economies of scale? You have a bad business model with one building. What happens when you have 100 buildings? It gets an even, I mean, you're multiplying it. There are companies you sit there and say, there's no way for me out of here. It's broken. This business model is broken. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. I'm not paying for this company. So how did WeWork get to the markets and get an estimated pricing of $95 billion from Goldman Sachs? I'm not kidding. That was the original estimate Goldman Sachs put out for what they thought WeWork was in September of 2019. Talkers, will it be 95 billion? Will it be 80 billion? So what is it about WeWork that made it look so pricey to Goldman Sachs? Who are the VCs who funded WeWork along the way? There's really one VC who did 7 of the 10 rounds. It was SoftBank. And when you say SoftBank, there's Masa Son. You heard of Masa Son? In 2019, he was viewed as deity level, the God level investor. He made 300-year plans. What does it tell you when a person makes 300-year plans? He's got God delusions, right? Basically, I am God, I can make 300-year plans. It's almost like the gods are waiting for you to make 300-year plans. Master Son had accounted for 7 of the 10 rounds. And the most recent round before the public offering, SoftBank had priced WeWork at $47 billion. You know what Goldman Sachs did, right? They took the 47, they doubled it. Then they added 1, or they got the doubling wrong. I don't know what the reason was. They came up with $95 billion. And then they reversed engineered it to make it look like they did an intrinsic valuation. Saying, oh, banks are more banks price things. They price things based on what other people pay. And the reaction was, he's a smart guy. If he pays $47 billion, this company must be worth at least twice that. And of course, this was one of those duration mismatches where the IPO fell apart. You know what made it fall apart? The arrogance of Adam Newman, who was the CEO of WeWork, combined with the arrogance. I always often want to think about being a fly on the wall when Adam Newman and Masa Son are in a room together. 2 huge egos combined with arrogance in the same room. And they were so arrogant that in the prospectus, they'd actually put in a clause I've never seen in a public company. If Adam Newman were incapacitated, don't ask me why, maybe he slips on a banana and hits his head or something. You know what the sequence of who the next CEO be? In a typical publicly traded company, when a CEO is incapacitated, what happens? The board of directors gets together and they pick a different CEO, right? In the case of WeWork, in the prospectus is that if Adam Newman gets incapacitated, his wife, Rebecca Newman, what is this? French royalty? I mean, this is a company. But that tells you how much they thought they could get away with. 2 months later, the IPO fell apart. And the pricing kept dropping from 95 to 50 to, you know what finally stopped it? An investor came in and said, I'll pay $8 billion. You know who the investor was? WeWork. You know why they stopped at $8 billion? Because from WeWork's perspective, remember that what's happening, you have to, if you look at the balance sheet, they'd priced, from SoftBank's perspective, they'd priced WeWork at $47 billion. And because they have to mark to market every time it goes down, you have to tell investors they stopped at 8 because they were worried it'd go to 0. And I remember when it went, I said, please, don't let these words ever pass my mind again. But of course, 4 years later, the company comes back as a public company. It's like have you ever watched a Walking Dead episode? Okay. I remember my son watched this series for an entire summer. And this episode, I don't think there's any conversation in the show. It's screams and squeals and things being killed, but they keep coming back to life. WeWork reminded me of those Walking Dead characters. It comes back public, and I said, this is stupid. You still have the same problem. Why would you want to go public? And of course, a year later, it goes bankrupt. My question is, why did it take you guys so long to get to a destination I could have mapped for you when you told me about what kind of company you have? I hear now that Adam Newman is trying to buy back WeWork. He's saying, where did he get the money? Remember that $8 billion that I told you SoftBank paid for WeWork? $2 billion of that went out. There's no justice in this world. This guy creates a crappy business model and somebody pays him $2 billion to go away and he uses that money to try to buy back the crappy. Maybe they should let him buy it back and wipe out the rest of his money. That'll be justice. Right. The DER proposition is for the WeWorks of the world, and you'd be surprised at how many of those there are, companies that have bad business models where there's no chance of it being fixed. Which brings me to the final proposition, which is the don't freak out proposition. Especially if you're used to old-time valuation, you're used to seeing positive earnings, positive cash flows, and when you see negative cash flows, you freak out. I can't do this. It's a negative cash flow. But you can have companies with negative cash flows that turn positive. These are the companies which have business models that are decent, but early in the life cycle, they're going to lose money because they haven't scaled up yet. They haven't got the economies of scale. Unit economics are not working. These are the young companies of the world. Because young companies, you are going to see negative cash flows. And if you believe that they have promise, I valued Reddit a couple of weeks ago for the IPO. I think it'll get to profitability. It'll be a valuable company. I might be delusional, but these are the companies where you try to project out the future. So I try to think about valuation. I try to keep my valuations parsimonious. But let's face it, we've lost control of our valuations. Valuation today are more financial modeling than valuation. So I use the same spreadsheet pretty much to value every company, young companies, old companies. It's built around 5 drivers of value. 5, that's it. In fact, there are only 5 line items in my valuation. First is revenue growth. That captures the growth part of your business. Small company, big market. Second is the operating margin that I think you will arrive at after you get through the pain of being a young company. I'm looking past the pain. That captures the profitability of your business model. Third, to get that growth, you have to reinvest. Now, I could do the CFA thing of depreciation, CapEx, change in working capital, but with companies, ultimately, they all consolidate. It's what you put back into the business. And if you're an efficient company, you get more revenues per dollar of capital invested. If you're a less efficient company, so that becomes, so 3 levers: revenue growth, margins, reinvestment. I've essentially got your cash flows. And what do I need to discount those cash flows? A risk-adjusted discount rate. And we might use betas, you might use something else. I don't care. As long as it's risk-adjusted and you got a discount rate, you got the denominator. We're almost there, right? Expected cash flows come from growth, margins, and reinvestment. Discount rate comes from your perception of operating risk in the company and maybe the debt mix they have. You take the present value, and usually you're done. But here's a dirty little secret about discounted cash flow valuations that nobody talks about. When you do a discounted cash flow valuation of a company, you're valuing it as a going concern. You know what that means, right? You go through bad years, I assume that you recover, and you get to nirvana. What's nirvana in your DCF? What saves you in every company's valuation? You get to that big terminal value. Notice in DCF, no company ever fails. They all bounce back. In the real world, do companies actually fail? Of course they do. You invest in a young startup. 2/3 of startups don't make it to year 2. So I bring in a failure risk to capture the fact that this company might be susceptible to it. That's it. So if you take that as your starting point, that's going to become the platform I use to talk about, will AI affect the value of your company? For AI to affect the value of your company, what does it happen? Either your revenue growth has to get higher, which means you're selling stuff with AI components that makes it, or your margins have to get higher. What's the story you're hearing from companies? AI will reduce my costs. We're going to talk about why that is not a sufficient reason for pushing up margins. Maybe you can reinvest less because AI is going to do it, and you got to think about some creative way that happens. Maybe AI will make you a less risky company. Essentially, I'm going to leave the door open when somebody says AI. I'm going to go through each of the numbers. And if I can't find a place to put AI, my response is stop talking about AI. You're distracting me. You're a grocery store. Talk about your margins. Talk about how much of your inventory you have to throw out every day. Talk about how you're going to compete with Walmart, because that's what's going to drive value. So let's look at the history of leverage. As I said, we can learn by looking at the past. So as I said, I've had 4 revolutionary changes in my lifetime. And let's face it, we're not special. You think the generations that came before us didn't have revolutionary change? Of course they did, right? The first factories. Think of how much that changed the way people lived. The first automobile. So this is part of a long sequence of things that have happened in business. So let's think about what it is that makes a change revolutionary as opposed to incremental. Lots of things that are incremental. What is it? First, it has staying power. What does that mean? It affects people for a long time, right? It's not a fad. Often we mistake a fad. The metaverse was a fad. The question is AI a fad or is it but it has staying power. Second, it reaches across businesses. It's not just the companies in the space, but everybody's affected in one way or the other. And third, it reaches into our lives. To me, that's a critical component. It's not just business. You start to notice things you do that are affected by it. So as I said, there are 4 four big disruptions I've seen in my lifetime. The personal computers in the 80s, the internet in the 90s, smartphones in the 2000s, and social media. And you look across all of them, I'll make some general statements and you tell me whether you disagree. Each of these has created new businesses that have lasted a while. So the PC revolution created Compaq and Dell, and where are they now? Pretty much gone. That often happens over decades, but you had new businesses. Second, there are companies that they disrupt, that either drop in value. So the internet, who's the biggest winner? That is each of these businesses, let's think about who the biggest winner coming out of each business. Who was the biggest winner of the PC explosion? It was Microsoft. It wasn't the people making the PCs. They're now dead and gone. Microsoft, who was the biggest winner from the internet? It wasn't Cisco. It wasn't the architecture companies. It was Amazon. Biggest winner from the smartphone business, of course, is Apple. And the biggest winners in social media is still playing out, but for the moment, it's going to be the Googles and the Facebooks of the world. Now, when the PC business first exploded in the early 80s, you know who people thought was going to be the big winner? IBM. They thought IBM was supremely positioned to take it. But IBM dropped out. It just never made it. 1990, when the internet took off, people were convinced it was going to be the telecom companies that are going, because remember, everything flowed through phone lines. But they weren't the winners. What I'm trying to say is every one of these disruptions that happen, we think we got the winners, these are going to be the winners, and you look back 10 years later, that wasn't it. Right now, we've anointed NVIDIA and Microsoft as the winners of the AI space. But the game is still early, and if history is any guide, the architecture companies are not, I've never seen any of these disruptions, the architecture companies being the winner. It's companies that use the architecture to do more stuff. So if history is any guide, NVIDIA is not going to end up being the biggest winner of AI. It's going to be the people who use those AI chips to do other stuff. So maybe 10 years from now, I'll be back here and we'll see if that's right, but that's history. And for most companies, you know what these disruptions do? They become a cost to you. Not a cost saving, but a cost. Because you can't stay out of the fray, right? You can't say, I'm not going to buy PCs, everybody else can, because everybody starts buying PCs, you have to buy PCs. It's mutually assured destruction. Because everybody's cost structure has risen. Everybody's going to spend money on AI, you can see it coming. Because they're afraid that if they don't do it and their competitors do, they're going to be at a disadvantage. Now, if you think about personal effects, every one of these disruptions has created jobs. Right? You take each business or job. And some of you might actually be benefiting from those disruptions of the past because your job today came from that disruption of the past. At the same time, there are other people out there who are losing jobs because of that disruption. I think the politics of the last decade is a reflection of the fact that these disruptions have created losers, and we haven't paid enough attention to them. So guess what they're doing? They're voting the fact that, you talk about globalization, you talk about, technology. I'm a 55-year-old steel worker, and I've seen the dark side of disruption. You can actually argue that these disruptions have created as much dark stuff on the social side as good stuff. So as we think through AI, we've got to think about those consequences as well. But the promise I hear from AI advocates is this is going to push up markets collectively. AI is good. In fact, every time I get on CB, say, is AI the reason the market is up? I say, maybe it is. But long term, will AI make markets go higher? If history is any guide, it's not, and here's why. This is actually returns by decade. So there are the last 4 decades, I told you, big disruptions, 81 through 90, 91 through 2000, 2001 through 10. It's through the 90s you saw a boom in markets, but you look across the decades, and you look at disruptions effects, surprisingly muted, right? Because it turns out that there are winners, but there are also losers. The net effect on overall markets is, now, if you ask me, what will AI do for the next 10 years? I don't know. There'll be winners, there'll be losers. The net effect could be positive, negative, or neutral. So if this is your story for where overall markets are going to go, I don't buy it, because that's not the history of disruption. There's positives and negatives, and they're going to net up. So we look across these disruptions and we forget the dark side, those disrupted companies. Now, we pay so much attention, and I'll take the blame as well. I've valued Uber multiple times over the last 10 years. I've never valued, actually, let me take that back. I valued a taxi cab medallion in New York City once. Now, if you've been in New York City, you know, until Uber came along, the only way you could get from point A to point B, if you didn't take the subway, of course, was a yellow cab. In 2008, there were 13,874 yellow cabs in New York City. You know how we know with precision how many? Because to operate a yellow cab in New York City, you needed a medallion. So you had to buy the medallion. The medallion doesn't come with the car. So medallion is just the right, and then you go buy the car, which is the reason most taxi cab drivers in New York City don't actually own the medallion. Somebody else does, and then they lease it out. In 2008, a New York City cab medallion cost you $1.5 million, the right to operate one taxi. By 2015, that same medallion was going for $150,000. How many case studies have we seen about New York City cab medallions? In general, we pay a lot of attention to disruptors, not enough to disrupt it. And I'll be quite honest, this word disruption terrifies me. Because when I was growing up, you know what happened to the disruptors? I remember first grade, there was a disruptor in my classroom. A kid was, I lived in a very primitive classroom. You know what the teacher would do? Put a dunce cap on him, actually a paper cap, make him face the corner, and he could face only the corner. Now you'd be, child abuse, all kinds of things. And then at 10, the same kid, you know what would happen? Half the days he'd be at the principal's office. Disruptors were not good. They ruined your and my experience. So disruption has always been a bad word until Silicon Valley took the word and they made it a noble. What disruptors? You go to Silicon Valley, I'm a disruptor. So go sit in the corner, look at put a dunce cap on and be my reaction. But this became the end game for a business. You have a startup, what disruptors? But disruption creates costs, and those costs have to be factored when you think about it. So I'm going to set up a way I've started thinking, and this is something I didn't know when I started, but something that I've started to observe as each of these disruptions has gone through. I call it the big market delusion. I'm going to build it up in 3 steps. First step, you start with the big market. What's a big market? It could be geographic. You know, the 2 countries with the highest PE ratios at the end of 2023 were India and China. Now you can talk about the stocks being overpriced, but what is it about India and China that makes them such attractive targets? But where's the growth coming from, right? It's 1 billion plus people. That is the thing you can't replicate. Can you imagine Uruguay saying, we're going to go for 1 billion people in the next 10 years? Where the heck would you fit them? And who would create this 1 billion people? I mean, we're not rabbits. We can't have 26 babies at the same time, right? Big markets. That's what made China so attractive to every company. Huge market. So big market can be geographic. It can be related to technology. Software is a big market. Retail is a big market. So that's the first step. You have a big market, and you can name the market. And right now, people are talking about how big AI could be as a market, so you see that come into play. So that's the first piece, first building block, your big market. The second building block is psychological. Now, I don't know whether you read the news that Daniel Kahneman died just a couple of weeks ago. And he revolutionized the way we think about finance and investing. Kahneman was a psychologist. And for a long time, economists thought of themselves as scientists, which is stupid because you deal with people. And people don't behave in predictable ways. And Kahneman said, you make up all this nice stuff, but that's not the way human beings behave. And overconfidence is one of those behavioral traits that shows up in lots of different places in finance. So let's connect this to big market. You have a big market, and you're an entrepreneur. Any of you entrepreneurs? This may be an Uruguay problem. So now we'll come back and talk about entrepreneurs. But do you know entrepreneurs? No? Yeah. Do they tend to be diffident people or overconfident people? To start a business, you got to be overconfident. You got an overconfident entrepreneur looking at a big market. So you're overconfident. What are you telling yourself? I can conquer that big market. But you need capital, right? So if you're a founder starting a business, who do you approach for capital? Venture capitalists. Overconfident people or diffident people? Extraordinarily overconfident. They think they can pick winners, and they picked you as the winner. So let's see what we have. You have an overconfident founder surrounded by overconfident venture capitalists looking at a big market saying, we can conquer that market. And remember, it's a big market. There are 100 other clusters just like yours, all thinking the same thing. You got a big market, you got these clusters of overconfidence. And you know how this shows up, right? If you're overconfident, what does it mean? You think you'll get a much bigger share of the market, make much higher profits. You're convinced you're smarter than everybody else. And you price your company accordingly, right? You say, I think I'm going to be the winner. And the third element you need is to bring in pricing. And if you're an overconfident people, you attach a high price to your company. Your VCs attach a high price to your company. Do you see where this is going? You have 100 clusters of overconfident people all overpricing their companies. Each of them thinks they're rational. If I add up those 100 companies' pricing, I'm going to get too high a number, right? Because you can't all have 20% market shares. If there are 100 of you, because 100 times 20 gives me 2,000% market share, and I think mathematically we've hit a ceiling and kept going. Will the truth eventually come out? Yeah, as you start to struggle, you realize you're not making a 20% market share, you're making a 2% market share. Prices will start to adjust, and when they adjust, what do we call it? We call it a bubble bursting. I'm going to make a statement about bubbles, and they come from these three things. You've got overconfident VCs feeding overconfident entrepreneurs. Bubbles are a feature, not a bug. They come out of the fact that as human beings, we overreach. And eventually, there is going to be a correction. And we're going to look back and say, that was terrible. So I'll take you back in time. In 1999, we're at the peak of the dot-com boom. We're approaching 2000. And I remember, I think it's the Wall Street Journal created an index of internet companies because everybody was fascinated with dot-com companies. IPOs were hitting the market, 289 IPOs just in 1999. An IPO, you got this overconfident VC and overconfident investor going to a market where you've got overconfident investors kind of self-selecting. Well, that bubble burst, right? Why? Because eventually the truth is you can't all be growing. The market is only a finite size. There's a dot-com bubble bursting. And when that burst, what happened? People wagged their fingers and said, this is what happens when you invest in these tech companies. And then you'll hear these words, never again. Let me take you 15 years forward. Online advertising is taking off. And if you remember, think about online advertising, it's going after a market that's as old as time. Companies have been advertising, but before you had online advertising, how did you advertise? Through newspapers, through billboards, on TV. Maybe you sent out people to talk to other people. Let's face it, the advertising budget for companies is constrained, right? You can't be spending 15 trillion on advertising because where's the money going to come from? So in 2015, I looked at the size of the overall advertising market, and I accepted the reality that online advertising is going to become a bigger and bigger share because it's going to drive out the billboards, drive out the newspapers. I gave them a larger market share, but there's still a total market. And then I took every online advertising company that was public, the Googles, the Facebooks of the world, and I did some reverse engineering. It's actually a fun game to play when you have a sector like this, is take the market cap, and then ask yourself, how much will the revenues have to be in year 5 or 10 to justify the market cap? And I did that for every company. I added them all up. And I came up with about, well, let's see, 522 billion, which basically already are blowing, and this is just existing companies. Another bubble waiting to burst, and it showed up in companies like Snapchat that thought they could be. I mean, I remember, the owner of Snapchat, the founder of Snapchat, Evan Spiegel. He's married to Miranda Kerr, who's a model, and he lives in the luxury life in LA. The time before he took the company public, his godfather is a good friend of mine. Brad Cornell used to teach at UCLA, so Brad calls me and he says, "Can you talk to this guy? He's got a new business. He's going to take it public." And I thought it was going to be some small company. So he says, "My godson's name is Evan Spiegel." And I says, "Is the company by any chance Snapchat?" He says, "Yes, wants to talk to you because he was taking it public." So I talked to him. We met at a restaurant. It was really a coffee shop because I had to go back to teaching. And he told me his plans. He said, "I want to make Snapchat the next Facebook." And I told him what was on my mind. I said, "It's not going to happen." Why does Facebook make so much money from advertising? Why is it one of the successes? How many of you have Facebook? Instagram? WhatsApp? Collectively, there are 3 billion people in the Facebook ecosystem spending 57 minutes every day in that system. You say, "I wouldn't do that." I think you should track your time and see how much time you spend checking your Instagram, posting on Instagram. I have 57 minutes where I can show you ads, right? Snapchat, even at its peak, first, it was a niche audience. I could never snap or chat, and definitely not do both at the same time. Forget about Snapchat stories. My daughter explained, "I am not going there. This sounds like a lot of work to me." So first, the audience is a niche. No. So 75-year-olds might show up on WhatsApp or on Facebook. They're not Snapchatting. Their phone skills are not that good to begin with, right? The camera, the selfie skills you need. So it's a niche market. And they're not spending 57 minutes a day on Snapchat. But his initial objective was, this is overconfident. I can make my company. And of course, it rose, and then it's collapsed, and it stayed down, because people now recognize it's not going to be the next Facebook. If it's lucky, it'll be a niche online advertising business. So eventually, corrections happen. And here's my final example. As you know, much in the US, cannabis is legal in some states. Is cannabis legal in Uruguay? Okay. Cannabis is legal in San Diego. Every time I take my dog for a walk, I come back high, my dog comes back high, everybody's smoking, everything smells like skunk now, right? You walk by the beach, there's a skunk. Initially I think, why is a skunk smell coming at the beach? And after I said, this isn't a skunk smell. That's somebody smoking cannabis. But because there's a patchwork, in 2018, cannabis stocks, they were mostly Canadian companies, and they soared. And I remember taking the market cap, reverse engineering the revenues, and say, for this to work, everybody on the face of the earth, their dog, their child, and the baby has to be smoking cannabis all the time. I don't care if it's legal, that's not going to happen. But that's, again, something you will see as this process plays out. And in the cannabis stocks, you saw that rise, and then people said, that's a lot we're paying for these companies. Who's smoking all this cannabis? And it turned out that there isn't enough cannabis smoking in the world to explain it. Maybe if enough people smoke cannabis, they'll be so out of it and they'll pay whatever price you ask them to pay. But that's a different story you need to tell to come explain why prices stay high. So what does this mean for AI? There will be this talk of AI. You'll see all these companies get priced on the promise of it's a big market. In fact, watch out for this. People, the AI company go public, say, why should I pay for your company? The market's going to be so big. That's it. That's the whole story. What is your company? Doesn't matter. The market is so big. It's huge. They won't use a number, right? Because they actually don't know how big the market is. But it's huge. Second, they act like they're the only ones acting and the rest of the world this always amazes me. It's almost like they skip game theory entirely in their education. But if you see something interesting, you think you're the only person who's acting. There are a dozen people, or maybe 100 people doing what you're doing, completely blind to competition. The whole story is about scaling up, how big they can get. You ask them, how do you plan to make money? Say, that will be later. We'll think about it after we get big. It's a mindset that came out of the last decade. And it's a complete disconnect from basic business questions. Because for growth to turn to profits, you got to tell me a story about how that happens, right? Maybe it's economies of scale, maybe it's unit economics, but you'll see an absolute unwillingness to go there. So I will predict that there will be an AI bubble, and I will predict it will burst, and when it happens, people are going to say, this is what's wrong with markets. But I think it's good to have bubbles. Strange thing to say. But do you want to live in a world run by actuaries? You know any actuaries? They're nice people, but extremely boring. Extremely boring, right? You go to dinner, they're estimating the probability that the wine is actually the wine that you ordered. Everything is, they're very good with statistics. A world run by actuaries would still be in caves. This fire thing, too risky. Let's wait a few more 1,000 years. They'll be fully tested, and then we can come out of the cave. Every advance in humankind has come from people overreaching. The dot-com bubble that burst, did it change the way we live? Absolutely. The smartphone bubble that burst, every bubble will burst, but it'll create change. You don't like bubbles? Then don't ask for change. I don't think you like bubbles in Uruguay, right? This is not your thing. But I don't blame you. You live next door to your crazy uncle. You have enough bubbles and bursting there. I know this is like a movie. You're sitting there with the popcorn, the bubble is burst, and you get the spillover effect. So I don't blame you for it. But when people talk about the equity culture means you're okay with bubbles. You're okay with things going up and crashing. It's not the end of the world. No, you pick up yourself and you try again and again. It's a mindset, right? Yesterday I was doing the corporate life cycle session, which I did, I think last time, or I did narrative and numbers, but I did it a few times ago. So yesterday in the corporate life cycle, I took the 10 largest US companies in terms of market cap, right? You know what they are, right? What's the largest company in the world? Microsoft, then you got Apple, then you got NVIDIA. But you go down the list, there isn't a single manufacturing company, and there isn't a single bank left there. Many of these companies are 20, 30, 40 years old. They're not old companies. Then I took the 10 largest companies in Brazil in terms of market cap. You know the largest is? Petrobras. Up to 106 billion. It's doing really well. You think management must have changed. It's amazing what a $100 oil price will do for you as an oil company. You go down the list, there are 4 banks. You got Petrobras, you got Vale. I think other than New Bank, which might be the only company there which has any hope of growth, these are all mature, established companies. I was going to take the 10 largest market cap companies in Uruguay, but I won't go there. Because I can't go beyond one. Last time I came, this was my struggle. I wanted to pick an Uruguayan company to value, and after about 5 hours of trying, I can't even try this anymore, right? I keep coming back to a sample size of 1, and this is not working for me. But there's a question to ask: what is it that that creates this dynamic shifting in the US, where as disruptions happen, you see so you look at the US top 10 list, you go from 1980 to 1990, you see the shift. With each disruption, you see companies rising to the top and a new set of companies. But for the last decade, there are 2 groups of companies that I've kind of been obsessed with, that I've written about. One is what I call the FANG-AM stocks. Okay? Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, Apple, and Microsoft. Why am I obsessed with them? Because those 6 companies alone accounted for 20% of the increase in market cap of all US stocks. There are 7,000 US stocks. These 6 stocks, without them, the US would have had a very, very average or a below average decade in terms of stock returns. In the last 3 years, that attention has shifted to what's called the Mag 7 stocks, which includes many of the FANGAM stocks, but now you throw in NVIDIA and Tesla into the mix. And there's a lesson there. It's not that these 7 stocks are special, but as the economy evolves, you're seeing the winners kind of cycle through. And it clearly happens in the US. It doesn't happen in Brazil. It doesn't happen in Europe. It doesn't happen in Japan. And the question is, what is it that allows it to happen? And it's a combination of this, there are entrepreneurial Uruguayans, I'm sure. You know where they end up. In Silicon Valley, probably, right? The same thing for Brazilians. And you get access to capital, and venture capital is willing to make bets. So there's a whole infrastructure in the US. I'm not saying it's good or bad. It creates noise and chaos, but it is the process by which you see disruption play out in winners and losers. The US, the reason I have to care about AI is when I look at 10 years from now, I look at the top 10 companies. There will be a couple of companies there that'll be there because of AI. Will they be NVIDIA? I don't know yet. And that's what makes it exciting. But I will predict, because this goes back to what I said about unit economics. What I see has changed in the 21st century is as we've gone from the old time manufacturing, financial service, retail-oriented 20th century. Look at technology. We have created winner-take-all economics. Okay. Say advertising, right? Pre-online advertising, the biggest advertising company in the world, let's say it's the New York Times, probably had a 4% market share. It's kind of capped. Why? Because you were local. I mean, if you were in LA, you bought the LA Times, you didn't buy the New York Times. If you did billboards, you couldn't do them all over the world. You did them locally. The nature of the business was you'd have 20, 25, 30 companies kind of in the space. But with online advertising, that breaks down, right? Why? What is it about online advertising that's made it a much more concentrated business? If you're an advertiser, where do you want to go? Where everybody else is, right? You don't want to kind of hang out on your own in Snapchat if you can be on Facebook. You don't want to advertise on Bing if you can be on Google. It's called a networking benefit, where as you get bigger, it actually gets easier for you to get bigger. And here's what's going to happen. The biggest winners are going to end up with 40 or 50% market shares. Guess what? You look at the top 10 list of US companies, you see the winner-take-all phenomenon kick in. Now, the question with AI is this a business where you're going to get winner-take-all economics? It's a question that I've been fascinated with NVIDIA. Remember I said I do valuation for an audience of 1? You know why I valued NVIDIA last summer? Because I bought NVIDIA in 2018 because at that time it looked undervalued to me. I would love to tell you because I could see AI coming. No, it wasn't even on the horizon. I just got lucky about it. And it had hit 450 by last summer. And I said, I don't want to look at it in a 450, it's too good to be true. And finally I said, I can't keep looking away. I've got to value the company. Why? Because if I bought it when it was undervalued, what do I need to do when it's overvalued? Sell it, right? So I looked at NVIDIA, and I looked at it from a position of ignorance. I'm not an engineer. I don't even know what an AI chip looks like. Do any of you know what it looks like? I don't know, is it like a regular potato chip? Is it small? Is it big? I have no idea, right? So when I started to value the company, I said, okay, NVIDIA in 2023 had a 75% market share of the AI chip business. And I said, why does it have such a big market share? It turns out that the research they did made their chips more efficient in terms of power use, because that's a big deal. And they actually, with the chip, they bundled software called CUDA. Don't even ask me what the software does. I have no idea. But it's software that goes with the chip that makes it run more efficiently. Now, the reason they were able to do this is nobody else noticed this business. They thought it was going to. So now it's a big business. Guess what's happening? Everybody else is lining up to enter. AMD, Intel. Now everybody wants to do it. So the question I had was, hey, will this become a winner-take-all business, or will it become splintered? Because traditionally, chip businesses get splintered. It's a huge question because it's going to drive my valuation. So the question is, how sticky is this? If I start to create an AI system with an NVIDIA chip, let's say 3 years from now, I want to expand the system. Am I stuck with the same chip, or can I do an AMD chip? I don't know the answer. So I actually had to, I did the valuation and let people tell me how wrong I was, and a few of them were chip engineers, and I learned about the stickiness in the model, that once you start to create a system with one company's chip, it's actually very difficult. That's going to become a basis for whether this business is going to get concentrated or spread out, right? And that's going to have consequences to which of these chip companies might be the second or the third company in the space. So when you think about bubbles, we think about them as a bad thing. Regulators don't like them. They want them to go away. Politicians don't like them. They try to pass policies. And I think they're missing the point. A world without bubbles is a world without change. You can't have one without the other. I still remember a conversation I had with the regulator of Singapore markets, Singapore equities, actually. And he said, you know, we'd like more trading happen in Singapore. Everything seems to go to Hong Kong or to... And he said, what should we do in Singapore? I said, I'll give you the answer, but you're not going to like it. You want a lot of trading. You have to be willing to live with chaos, because trading brings in... And if you've ever been to Singapore, you know what they think about chaos, right? This is like Disneyland on steroids. I mean, it's a city that basically anything that perturbs the standards kind of throws them off. I said, you guys don't like chaos. Don't ask for trading to show up, because if you want people to trade, you got to be willing to live with the noise that comes with trading. And one of those things is bubbles. So let's talk a little bit about, we're getting towards the end, but I kind of have, I'll show you a little bit about how AI is going to play out there. I mean, a year ago, before ChatGPT, if you asked me what the AI effect is, I have no idea. I don't know what it is, how it will play out. But clearly, the conversation has shifted, especially with NVIDIA shifting it. But if you think forward, 10 years from now, if this becomes the revolutionary change that we think it is, you're going to get AI companies in 4 different quadrants. You are going to get our architecture companies that have, because remember, you need those powerful computers and chips. So the NVIDIAs, the AMDs, the companies that provide that architecture are going to be there. But and I'll make a prediction, they're going to become a smaller and smaller percentage of the overall AI business if history is any guide. Just like Cisco started in the 1990s being the big player, and then as the business evolved. You need software, right? Because the computers need to run in something. So there will be companies that will be AI software companies that give the software for these chips. But remember, all of this works only if you have data to play with, because AI, the computers without data are just computers, right? There will be businesses built around bundling and selling data. There'll be data companies. And if you think about the players in this game as to who has the biggest chance of being in the data business, it's those companies that have exclusive data about you. Now, when big data became this buzzword, it's going to create value. My question is, hey, is it exclusive? Is it data that you and only you have? If the answer is yes, then we can talk a big data story. But if it's data that everybody can have, if everybody has it, nobody has it. Now, when I think about big data and companies that are in special position, 2 companies come to mind. One is Amazon. What does Amazon know about you? More than you wanted to, right? They know every item you've bought. They also know every item you looked at and did not buy. Remember, that's recorded as well. And God help you, we have Alexa in your house, because they know what your kids think about you while you're out of the room, right? So there's data, it's exclusive to Amazon. So would I be surprised if Amazon became a player in this game? Not at all, because they have that ammunition of big data. The other is Netflix. If you open up my Netflix, there are like 100 shows where 3 minutes into the show, I gave up. All those Spanish shows, that came from what is that, Money something, I watched and say, if I were Spanish, I would be insulted because everybody in the show is so incredibly stupid. The criminals are stupid, the detectives are stupid. It's kind of insulting to watch the show, but became a hit. Money Heist, right? Was that what it was called? Okay. So Netflix knows every show you watched and every show you gave up on. You're saying, so what? Netflix is it's the biggest content producer in the world right now. You know what their objective is? To get you to watch the same movie over and over again for the rest of your life. They figured out what you like, they will just change the character. You like the Korean character, I'll put in a Japanese character in the next version. You won't notice the difference, but I'll tell the same story. It's kind of a terrifying thought. But when you think about data, you're thinking about people with exclusive data. Data by itself is not going to do it, but exclusive data is going to be a player in the AI game. And finally, will there be AI products and services? Yes. Right? Especially in businesses and occupations where you do mechanical things. The machine is always going to be better at mechanical things than you and I can, right? I told you about the Damodaran bot. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. 2,500 pages of, even my best student, I said, go read that even if they have time. You read 2,500 pages, nothing is going to stick, that's too much. Look at every evaluation, human beings can't hold on. A computer can though. So if what you're doing is mechanical, sooner or later, AI is coming for you. Right? So there will be products and services directed at those jobs. You know why consulting is in trouble? Have you ever read a consulting report? Try to read 5 reports from the same consultant. There's so much cutting and pasting going on here, right? Sometimes they forget to change the name of the company. That happened actually with one well-known consultant. Hey, you're cutting and pasting out of a cookbook. Guess what? AI is coming for you, and I will zero sympathy when that happens. Okay? Now, in terms of social effects, I don't know what they will be. But here's what I know. Silicon Valley, with every one of these changes, upfront tells you things are going to be amazing and great when this happens. And 10 years later, you look back and said, that wasn't true. With every one of these disruptions, there are things we've lost. With social media, you can see that we're already saying the net effect of social media might be more negative than positive, but the way it's changed the way we have conversations, the kind of side effects it's created. With AI, at least, there seems to be a recognition that this is a genie that you're letting out of the bottle. And the history of genies that get out of the bottle, it's very tough to put them back. 10 years from now, we're going to be looking back at AI and we're going to be chronicling some good stuff that came out of it, but there's also going to be a whole host of things we look back and say, you know what? We've lost some stuff and the net effect can be negative. You can see it happening, but here's the bad news. It can't be stopped. The genie is out of the bottle now. You can try to regulate it. You can try to legislate it. Now, that's why I don't think Brazil will be able to stop Twitter. Twitter is unstoppable, no matter how much you can take their revenues away, but they're not making any money anyway. So I lose Brazil. I say, oh, who cares, right? So in a sense, that's part of the process. You're going to see this play out. So I'm going to very quickly, I know because I want to give you some time for Q&A, go back to the summer of last year when I wanted to value NVIDIA. I knew the stock price was 450. I knew how the game had changed. AI had become part of the buzzword. So whenever I sit down to value a company, I call this surveying the landscape, getting a sense of the business. I started by looking at the semiconductor business in the 4 decades it's been around with us. Remember, this is a relatively young business. It was born out of the PC business, another one of those. So Intel made its fortune by PCs increasing and having the chips that go into them. And if you look at the 40 years, the semiconductor chip business has been an up and down business. It's an incredibly volatile business. Okay? So you can see the cycles, the margins, the revenue growth rate goes up. But if you look at where they were in 2023, before AI entered the picture, this was becoming a mature business. Semiconductors are not the growth business they were 20, 30 years ago. They're a mature business. So that already raises the ante, because now as a company growing in this business, you either have to take market share from somebody else or find new businesses. Okay? And here's where I think the other aspect, if you look at profitability, again, it goes through these cycles: high profit, low profit, high profit, low profit, and this has been the history of the business. So it's converging on low growth. Margins are starting to shrink because much of this business is getting commoditized. So the overall business, if you look at it, it's not great news for a company to enter. But NVIDIA is different. And you can see, as the ups and downs, markets also go up and down. You have a good year. So essentially, this has been an up and down business, and NVIDIA is part of this business. But over the last decade in particular, NVIDIA has stood out. And you can see over time, the shifting cast of characters. 1990, a lot of Japanese companies up there. And as you go through time, even in 2022, NVIDIA was the 8th largest chip company in the world. So 2023 was actually a surprise. If you ask 2020, you ask somebody, which chip company will be the winner, they'd have come up with a whole host of companies. NVIDIA might not have made it. AI was the tipping point that moved it. So here's what, and the end users are shifting. But let's start with the AI story. Here's in NVIDIA's history. It too has had its ups and downs. I mean, people act like NVIDIA's never had a down year. But if you look at its lifetime, it's had ups and downs. 2018 happened to be one of those down years, which is when the stock traded like $27 or $29, which is when I bought it. And the reason I bring that up is often when you look at big winners today, your reaction is, I would never have been able to buy that company, which is absolutely not true. I talked about the FANGAM stocks and the MAG 7 stocks. If you look at the last 15 years, every one of those companies has been undervalued 2 or 3 times during the course of that period. So if you did not buy NVIDIA in 2018, for God's sakes, don't buy it now, but watch it, because what's the history? This too shall pass. That 880 might become 350, who knows when. No. And you can see the ups and downs. But this is what I think makes NVIDIA stand out. It's the fact that it's been able to jump into these big markets like, gaming, like crypto, like AI, and get there first. And as I said, when you do it 3 markets in a row, it's got to be something within the company that's leading them to markets before they become big markets. Now, Jensen Huang is now considered the greatest CEO on the face of the earth. And some of that reputation is deserved, some of it is not. But clearly he set some kind of theme in the company where he's directed resources and he's picked the right people, and their job is to find the next big market and get ready for it. So they might have picked 6 markets and only 3 have paid off, but if they pay off, it pays off big time. So in my original valuation of NVIDIA, I'm going to cut to the valuation. The story I told was I was going to break it down into businesses, because clearly the AI business was unique. So the question is, how would you value the AI in NVIDIA? Remember the IT proposition, right? So value AI, what do I need to do? I need to estimate the cash flows I will get from AI. I need to estimate the margins. I need to estimate the reinvestment and estimate the risk. So help me out here. I'm sitting in 2023, summer of 2023. I want to estimate NVIDIA's AI revenues. What do I need to estimate first? In 2023, the AI chip market was 80 billion. NVIDIA owned 65 billion of that market. That market share already is a little bit of a problem, right? Because you have that big a market share to grow, there's not much room to grow. Luckily for them, the overall AI chip market is expected to get much bigger. How much bigger? I had no idea when I sat down. So I started looking and I got 400 billion, 350 billion, 325 billion, 250 billion. I ended up using one of those numbers. And this is what I meant about when you face uncertainty, make an estimate and move on. Because your reaction is, our numbers are so different. What the heck do I do? You wring your hands and you keep wringing your hands. The numbers are not going to converge on you magically. Pick a number. And later on, I'm going to ask you how uncertain you're about this number. So my starting point was the total market is going to be about 325 billion. To estimate NVIDIA's revenues, what's the next thing I need to estimate? What share of that market will NVIDIA have, right? And that's where this debate about, is this going to be a sticky business or not, came in. Because if it's not sticky, I probably should give them a 25 or 30% market share, because ultimately other players are going to come in, squeeze them. I made the assumption that they would remain a dominant player. I do think the 75% is going to come down because the new players like AMD are going to come in, but I gave them a 60% market share. I'm getting there, right? 325 billion, 60%, that's a lot of revenues, 195 billion by year 10. I then have to estimate what margins will NVIDIA make. Now, normally chip makers make 25%, 20% margins. It's a pretty profitable business. Making the chip is costly. You need to invest in plant. But what does NVIDIA does? It designs the chips and lets TSMC make it. It's more like a software company, an intermediary than it is. You know how this is going to play out, right? In steady state, their margins can be 45, 50% because the design is all you do. Somebody makes it, you charge a premium on it, and you make that margin. So my valuation, I gave them a 50% margin. You say, how do you know all this stuff? I don't. I'm just making it up as I'm going along, right? Based on the best information I can get. And it's not much there. But let's face it, nobody else has that better information either. So you take the revenues, you put in a market share, you get margins. I've got expected profits from AI for the next 10 years. What's the last thing I need to estimate? Well, I need to estimate how much NVIDIA will have to invest to keep this business growing. Now, normally, if it's a semiconductor company, that investment would be in new chip factories. But given NVIDIA is a design company, you know what they're going to be investing in, right? It's going to be R&D. So basically, I put in a pretty hefty chunk for R&D. It is going to happen. They might have to acquire other interesting technologies to make it work. And I built in the reinvestment. Bottom line, the AI part of NVIDIA gave me a value of about almost 200 billion. And my estimate of the value for NVIDIA overall was about 500 to 600, which I thought was a big number, right? But that translated into a value per share of about $250 to $300 per share. Stock was trading at 450. So if I truly believe in intrinsic valuation, what should I be doing? Selling all the shares. I sold half my shares. And you should have seen the blowback I got, which is, you don't believe in intrinsic value. And I said, look, you're right. I think it's overvalued. And if I were a purist, I should be selling it. But I'm going to sell half because I also worry about this psychological thing called regret. Have you ever felt it? Yeah? Never, right? You know how regret would play out. I sell at 450 because I think it's overvalued. It goes to 850. I'm beating myself up. But that's not the worst part. It's not the regret itself that's dangerous. It's what it does in terms of future decisions. Because you know what I'm going to do next, right? The next time a stock goes up, I'm going to hold on to it. I remember what happened in NVIDIA. This is how investment defeats become debacles. So I said, you know, I'm selling half because I'm going to win either way. If it goes up, you know what I do? I point to the half I did not sell. I said, look, I did the right thing. And if it goes down, I said, I point to the half that I sold. You know, this sounds completely irrational, but I'm a human being. It makes me sleep better at night. It keeps the regret factor away. So I sold half my NVIDIA at 450. And you know what it did later, right? It went to 850. So I sold another half. Have I left a lot of money on the table? Absolutely. Does it bother me? No. And here's the other psychological thing. It depends on how you frame. You know how I frame NVIDIA? I bought it at 27. I could have sold it at 850, but no, I sold it at 450. I'm not going to complain. That's a 24. If every one of my investments did what that did, no, it'd be great. So some of this is just, you know, framing how you think about decisions and how it plays out after you make the decision. Do I think NVIDIA is overvalued at $2 trillion? Absolutely. I actually reverse engineered how big the AI chip market has to be. It's actually a great thing to do in Excel is use the solver function in Excel. You know, solve for the revenues you will need in year 10 to justify. Because remember, I'm at 50% margins. My margins can't go much above that. So the revenues have to be much higher. And it turns out the chip market alone has to be I think $1.2 trillion to break even. I put this out and somebody said, but the AI market is going to be 2 trillion. Basically, that's what bugs me about this. People talk about the AI market is including everything, right? It could be 2 trillion, but it's the architecture for AI can't be 1.2 out of that 2 trillion. How will those people make money if you're paying the bulk of the market to buy the chips to keep this going? The history of revolutionary change is as markets mature, the portion of the value that comes from the architecture businesses will get smaller rather than larger. So I think it's overvalued. Would I buy NVIDIA now? Of course not. Would I sell the rest of my NVIDIA? I've sold 3/4 already. If it goes to 1,600, maybe I'll sell another half. No. But I think that if you don't have NVIDIA and you like the company, and this is where you need to separate great companies from great investments. NVIDIA is a great company. I'm not even debating that. It's got an amazing CEO. But right now, it's a terrible investment because the price is too high. Intel is just a blah company. It's got a blah management and a blah strategy. But at the right price, Intel might be a better investment than NVIDIA is. That separation between a good company and a good investment is driven. And there are going to be a lot of good AI companies that come out there. But at prices, you're going to look at and say, those are nosebleed prices. But don't give up on them. Because if history is any guide, there will be a cleaning up process where those prices are going to drop. And they're probably going to drop too much, because that's the nature of investors. They're going to get disappointed. They're going to sell everything in the AI space and go. And that's when you can step in and say, that's my spot in that space. So this is going to be an interesting period, because you're already seeing IPOs lining up. ARM, ARM, the company that another SoftBank, funded company, went public last year. But there are going to be new companies coming in. And the one thing I'd be cautious about is companies that claim that AI will make them more valuable because they'll reduce costs. I hear this from a lot of companies, that you want to use AI to reduce costs. You know why that story doesn't fly? Let's say Kroger comes back and says, we're going to find a way to use AI to reduce your costs. That's why we'll become more profitable. What should the question you should ask them be? Are you the only one who's going to be able to use AI to reduce costs? If everybody's able to use AI to reduce costs, guess what's going to happen? The costs across the board are going to drop. Any competitive environment, the prices are going to drop. You might end up worse off with a lower cost structure than you ended up with a higher cost structure. And that's been the history of every one of the previous disruptions. PCs did not make banks more profitable, because everybody had PCs. It became part of your cost structure, and whatever savings you had got passed through. So when you look at these stories of AI is going to make me more valuable, probe, ask yourself, where is that value coming from? Use the IT proposition, and then ask, are you special? Are you the only one who can get this from AI? And the answer for 95% of companies is going to be, you're not special. You're not the only one who can do this. And I wanted to give you enough time to ask as many questions as you wanted, so I'm going to pause, stop there, and you don't need the mic. If you want to use the mic can be passed through, but don't need the mic. If you ask a question, I would repeat the question back. Yes. Have I valued MAD? What's MAD? Expand the. I'm sorry? Oh, AMD. Oh, AMD. I have valued AMD. It is of all the semiconductor chip companies, the one closest to NVIDIA in terms of being a company that in gambling and crypto tried to keep up. Because if you think about chips, there are the broad market for chips, most of it is commoditized, right? You're making chips for things which, for your smartphone, you don't need. But AMD and NVIDIA have been the two companies that were able to be in the high end. But in AI, NVIDIA seems to have jumped ahead of AMD. And the question is AMD going to be the twin again? And that's what's going to drive your valuation. I think the problem for AMD is they got in too late. By the time they noticed the AI business, so did 6 other chip companies. And I'm not sure they have a significant advantage over the other chip companies. So I have valued AMD. I don't think they're significantly under, because there is an AI buzz in them as well, not as big as NVIDIA. And I think people are now not factoring in. At this point, everybody and his brother and his son and his niece and his cousin wants to be in AI. It's going to be tough to keep them out. No. Yes. Yeah.
So not just this recent
Yeah.
AI push, but just the scope of this kind of fiscally driven free money bubble. Where do you put this bubble as kind of in the scope of the
So
historical
the free money bubble, you're talking about the decade of low interest
Post-COVID,
rates.
low interest rates, post-COVID fiscal driven, just
Let's separate the two, because those two. The low interest rate thing, who do we generally, attribute that to? Who's been responsible for these low interest rates? Come on, you know the culprit. The Fed, central banks, right? And I think this is one of the most dangerous things I've seen in markets, is this belief that the Fed sets rates. I can see from your face, of course the Fed sets rates. I was on CNBC last week, they're talking about the Fed cutting rates. What's the only rate the Fed controls? The Fed funds rate. Have any of you guys borrowed at the Fed funds rate? I tried you can actually do a trip with the Fed. So last time I was in, and this was my kids were younger, I almost got me banned from the tour. I said, can you take me to the Fed window? I'd like to borrow the Fed funds rate, right? The Fed funds rate is a completely useless rate. It doesn't matter at all. The rates that matter, of course, are market set rates, treasury rates, short term and long term. And the question is, how much does the Fed influence those rates? And it's actually a very easy question to answer, because you can look at the relationship between the Fed. Turns out the Fed has an effect on short-term rates, the Fed funds rate, but at the very short end of the spectrum and to a limited extent. You know what drives long-term rates? Inflation. This year, at the start of the year, what did people tell us was coming this year, at least from the Fed? They were going to cut rates. And the prediction, we asked most, the rates in the end of the year will be lower than they are now, because the Fed is going to cut rates. The Fed raised rates 3 times last year. You know what the T-bond rate did last year? Nothing. It started the year at 3.88%. It ended the year at exactly the same number. First time that's happened actually in a century, the T-bond rate. So you say, why didn't it show up? Because as long as inflation stays at 3.5%, which is where it is in the US, the T-bond rate is not going to 2% no matter what dances the Fed does. So if we're talking about low interest rates the last decade, there's a reason rates were low. I have this graph on what I call the intrinsic risk-free rate, where I take the inflation rate each year and add the real GDP growth each year. You look at that graph, you know why rates were low last year, last decade? Because it was a decade of the lowest inflation in a century. The average inflation rate over the decade was 1.71%, lowest. And you had anemic real growth. You had low plus low, what do you get? Low. It's tough to get to high, right? I'll make a prediction. You're not going to go to low plus. So those people say, the Fed acts, we're going to go back to 2% rates. It's not happening. Unless inflation collapses and we go into recession. In which case the 2% rates don't help you that much anyway. What are you going to invest the money in, with all that, So this notion that markets were born up because of low interest rates really doesn't hold up. But do low interest rates create issues? They do. They create issues because you create what's called yield chasing. Right? Let's face it, a lot of people want to invest their money safely and earn a reasonable rate on the money. Partly because you might be older, you have a pension fund or Uruguay, and it could be any of those things, basically you want to. And when rates are really low, you get desperate. And when you get desperate, what do? You look for things that look like they will give you high yield. They're kind of dangerous, but you look the other way because you want to get the 4%. I would argue that a lot of the problems that came out of a decade of low rates reflect the fact that people search for things that will give them 4% rates in a world where the rates were 2%. And the only way you get 4% rates in a world with 2% risk-free rates is by taking some risks that you chose not to look at. So was there a problem that came out of the last decade because of low rates? Yes. Risk capital became too easily accessible. You know what risk capital is? It's a capital invested in the riskier spots of the market. If you're in the VC business, it's a capital invested in angel financing. If you're in the public markets, it's a capital invested in young, money-losing growth companies. If you're in the bond market, it's a capital invested in high-yield bonds, very low-rated bonds. And we had a decade of incredible access to risk capital.
On to WeWork?
Part of it did, but the risk capital was way more than that, right? It was everybody. And I'll tell you one of the things that happened, right? If you're a young, money-losing growth company, you had access to billions and billions and billions of dollars without people holding you accountable because they think, I could flip it to somebody else at a higher price. We gave these disruptors that I said bad things about enough capital to go out and disrupt, and they did. But we built these scaled-up companies, $100 billion in revenue. The company hasn't figured out how to make money. But let me ask you a question. Ride-sharing is a terrible business model. You know why? It's not sticky. You know what I mean by not sticky? I mean, every week I fly between San Diego and Newark. I take the red eye on Sunday night to come into Newark Airport in the morning at 5:30. I have to get into the city to my apartment. It's too early to catch the transit, so I take ride sharing. It's quick at the morning, 25 minutes I'll be in the city. And I have both Uber and Lyft on my phone. I click the Uber, I check it, and I click the Lyft and I check it. And guess which one I take every single time? The lowest one. I have no loyalty. In fact, the same driver is probably driving for both. What do I care whether I take Uber or Lyft? This model has no stickiness on the customer side. It has no stickiness on the driver side. And you cannot build a model which has no stickiness. And we've scaled ride sharing up to a point where you have hundreds of billions of dollars. What if Uber and Lyft both go bankrupt next year? How the heck am I going to get from the airport back home? You can take a cab. Remember, half the yellow cabs are now gone because Uber has disrupted them. They're not coming back overnight or even over a few periods. We've disrupted the status quo in lots of businesses with bad business models. Airbnb. Is it? I don't know. But we're ruining the hotel business along the way, right? And that risk cap, that to me was the biggest problem that came out of the last decade, is the amount of risk capital increases when rates are really low. Because, when I look at markets, there's safety capital and there's risk capital. Safety capital is the capital that goes into the more mature companies, and risk capital. That balance has to be maintained. In a good market, you need both. But you want either side to get too much. If you have too much safe capital and no risk capital at all, nothing gets started up. So you essentially have what you see in Brazil. No young companies come in because only the mature companies, the companies out there get business. But if you have all risk capital and no safety capital, then you have the other phenomenon of you're funding these companies with terrible business models and you're letting somebody else bear the consequences. So that was the problem. The COVID thing was a different problem. Only a politician thinks that mailing a check for $2,000 to everybody is a good idea. Right? They mailed it to everybody. My son, who was in college, gets a $2,000 check, and I said, Kieran, why are you getting the check? You don't have a job. There are studies that looked at all that COVID money and where it went. And if you look at the $2,000 that went to people below the age of 30, 60% of it, they actually traced the money, went into crypto. And you could have predicted that because in psychology, there's this phenomenon called found money. Here's how it works, right? Let's suppose you find a $100 bill on the floor. The way you spend that $100 will be very different than if you get a $100 bill you earn by working 3 hours. You find a $100 bill on the floor, guess what you're going to do? You're going to walk into the bar, have 5 big drinks, and there goes $100. Yeah, I just found money. And the problem with that COVID thing was it was found money going all over. And if you look at the inflation problem we have, you can blame whoever you want. You can blame supply chains. You can blame. The core reason for that inflation problem was all those $2,000 checks being mailed out to people who basically said, this is found money, I'm going to spend it. Now, just last week, a writer for the Financial Times called me, and she was writing an article on what is a real problem in the US and Europe, which is the boomers have accumulated a lot of wealth over their life. And people between the age of 25 and 35 have almost no wealth accumulation. They might have income, but they have no wealth. And we know it's a problem. So, there are think tanks, and they terrify me, because you know who works in think tanks. People have absolutely no sense of how the world works, right? So they have PhDs, they show up and say, this is the way the world works. So there's some think tank in the UK that's come up with an idea of taxing inheritances of the boomers. So already they're saying, let the boomer die, we'll collect it. And then passing it on to these 25 to 35-year-olds who have no wealth. And at first I think that's reasonable, it's a transfer of wealth. So she called me, what do you think about it? And I said, it's a terrible idea, and let me tell you why. First, we've heard the old rob Peter to pay Paul thing. You're robbing Peter to pay Paul's son, because you have two people, if you think about two 25-year-olds, one might actually have wealth. You know how? Because his father or grandfather worked and kind of built up wealth and passed it on. And you're essentially taking that wealth away from that person and you're putting it in another person. I said, let's say that the first time around you can say this is just, in fact, this think tank was connected to Thomas Piketty, French economist, which is kind of an oxymoron, which is, how do you be French and economist at the same time? But I guess there are French economists. And so this is a wealth transfer, and there have been, I said, can you name one wealth transfer model of a country that has actually created wealth? You can transfer wealth, but to create wealth, you have to think about incentive structures. Let's say you do this. You know the message you're sending to the next generation, right? Why bother saving money? Because you save money, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to wait till you die, take your inheritance, and pass it to the people. This is an incentive, and politicians never seem to think through incentive structures. You know what Canada just passed as part of the new budget? A 65% capital gains tax on any capital gains above 250,000 Canadian dollars. 250,000. If you think about it, you have a business, 250,000, you're going to hit very quickly. I mean, who thought this was a good idea? I mean, you might get that one-time transfer. They said it's affecting only 0.73% of the population. So what's the big deal? That's always the argument, right? It's a point. I say, okay, let's say you transfer this wealth. You get that capital gains tax. Who's going to start a business in Canada? I'm going to walk, if I have to Detroit and start the same business. But this is, I think, a problem with those COVID bills. And maybe, perhaps you can't blame them, right? Everybody was panicked. The world was coming to an end. You passed all these bad bills. So, but the COVID bill, I think, is at the source of our inflation problem. It's where, it's the original sin that we're all going to pay for as inflation kind of plays its way out. Any other questions? Yes. Go ahead and yell your question, because by the time the mic gets here, it might not know. Yeah.
Hello. AI actually in the investment business, yes.
You should be terrified in investing.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why. 90% of active investing is mechanical. Right? In fact, this is a problem you've been facing with, because ETFs, what do? They take these mechanical things, they replicate, and they charge people 10 basis points out of the 2% you're charging them every year. AI is coming for you. Yeah.
Particularly, for example, when we look at, it is likely that because of data being exclusively available to certain players or um, having certain technology.
What's the data you're talking about? Because it
For
can't be
example,
market data, it
Renaissance
can't be
Technologies, for example, they had been in business for 40 years.
It's data you collected on customers, basically. Is that what you're talking about? Because the rest of the data is everybody has it.
No, the thing is, for example, they are using their technology. They have been able to withstand time. Yes, they have been delivering 66% rate of return year over year for the last 40 years.
What are they?
taking
They're
a
around the
cut for-
mafia or something? Or
No, no.
It sounds like mafia level returns. I won't ask you who it is because,
But they are actually closed to new investors because they have reached
well, if you're the
capacity.
mafia, you definitely want to stay close because you don't want everybody investing in you. That sounds mildly illegal, to be quite honest, because active investing is one of the toughest businesses in the world to win
is.
at. And if you tell me you're beating the market by 66%,
They do.
there's something going on here which is not quite kosher. I'm going to use the Jewish word. I don't know what it is, but it can't be a skill set. So for you, AI might not be a problem because that component might not be replicable. It might be connections, and you leave it at that, or access to stuff you shouldn't have, and I will leave it at that. So nobody makes 66% excess returns running any kind of legitimate active investing business. None. I mean, what has Warren Buffett beaten the market by? Greatest investor of all time. 8% a year. 8% more than the market. What does the average active money manager deliver as an excess return? It's a trick question, minus 1.5% a year. It's one of the strangest occupations you can think of. I know many of you are in that occupation. Right? It's like starting a plumbing business called Floods Are Us. And here's what you do. I have a leak in my house, I call you and leave a flood, and then you send me a bill. That's effectively what active money management is, right? I collect your money, deliver less than you could make investing in an index fund, say, pay me. And you know what? One of my big questions is not why active investing is losing market share, but why that market share is not zero already. Because over the last 20 years, active investing has lost market share to ETFs, basic passive investing. It's most visible in the US because it's so easy to see how badly your mutual fund is doing, and so easy in your lunch break to take all that money and shift it to an index fund. Is this new? I think active investing has always been crappy. The only problem is in the 1960s, you know how crappy it was, right? Because what do you get once a year? You'd get a statement about what your fund did. You were up 8.3%. That's good, right? You had no frame of reference. Today, you're on your iPhones. I made 8.3%. They all seem to be making 12%. It takes you a second to recognize when somebody's underperforming, and one more second to move your money. There is actually this thing about what's making consumers and investors more powerful. There's access to data and ease. You can talk about the consequences for markets, and the consequences can potentially be devastating for markets. Last year, in fact, you saw this happen at a bank, Silicon Valley Bank. A week before Silicon Valley Bank was in trouble. If you'd asked me about Silicon Valley Bank, it looked pretty solid. In fact, they listened to what we learned from 2008, right? You can't invest in mortgage-backed securities. You have to invest in safe things. And what were the safe things they invested in? Treasuries, long-term. That might be an original sin, a duration mismatch again. But they'd have been fine. They had but over a course of 24 hours, that bank went from being a safe-looking bank where it met every regulatory to essentially a bank out of business. What happened? Deposits. Right? Deposits used to be sticky. How many of you have used the same bank for as long? Most of us, you put your money in a bank, you just leave it there. That's what's allowed banking to survive. Is it sticky because it's so much money? You actually had to go into the bank. You had to explain to the teller who looked at you with contempt about why you wanted to take your money out. And she made you dance a dance. And you'd have to talk to the manager who then tried to talk you out of it. And you were so exhausted by the time this was all dead. He said, let's leave the money in the bank. Banking is built upon deposits not being sticky. being sticky. So what's changed? Silicon Valley Bank is in a kind of microcosm of what banking might look like. So were the people invested in Silicon Valley Bank, who put their money in Silicon Valley Bank? It's people in Silicon Valley. Already you have a regional bias. And what do people in Silicon Valley do? They're always on their phones. Have you noticed this? They don't even talk to each other. I'll message you, you see the message on your phone. And so the minute there was this, and in fact, Silicon Valley Bank did the right thing. They wanted to raise capital to make their equity better. So they lined up Goldman Sachs. On Wednesday, the issue was going to happen on Friday. And then somebody caught wind of this is what Silicon Valley Bank is doing. And over the next 24 years, half the deposits pulled out. You could see tweets flying around. Take your money out of Silicon Valley Bank. This is something I think regulators need to factor in. Money has become less sticky, which means every bank is now riskier than it was 10 years ago. So if you're investing in a bank, in addition to doing all this stuff, you know what you should check? Check to see how old the customers are. You want banks with old customers, no young people. It'd be great if they could also tell you how many of them have Twitter accounts. You want to avoid banks with a lot of social media. Maybe regulatory capital requirements is show the social media of all your depositors. You have a lot of social media, you're a very risky bank, you have to hold more capital. Because this is happening in business after business, because we have access to money and it's giving us power as consumers, but in the process, we're creating these ripple effects that are going to create banks like Silicon Valley Bank play out over and over. I'm sorry, this has nothing to do with your question, but active investing might have the same non-stickiness. Now, you might not have it in Uruguay yet, but in the US, it's already happening. Wealth managers are complaining that clients who have been with them for decades are now kind of switching. So it is making active investing even more difficult than it historically has been. Yeah.
And my question actually is, let's assume that, for example, we want to value that company, the management company of the hedge fund, Renaissance Technologies, the Medallion Fund.
So you think we're talking about Jim Simon, 66%. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, I mean, he's getting that.
But remember that 66% was essentially, it's because you're compounding the first few years. The Renaissance has actually become a pretty average investor. What made Renaissance Capital so special up front? It wasn't the mob at that time. It was the fact that Jim Simon was the first person who actually took data seriously. I mean, think about it. Markets, we've been very casual with data, right? Think of how many times this stock is cheap because the average PE is higher. It's almost like we're in 1965. We're still using what about the rest of the data? So Jim hired math and physics PhDs, and so when he started, he was the only person actually, he was the original quant investor. He had the field entirely to himself. He made a ton of money because he found arbitrage just based on quant. Those days are done. I mean, Jim is open about admitting, if I started the fund today, I wouldn't be making the excess returns. But today, so if you ask me to value Jim Simon, there's no premium that I'd attach to Renaissance.
The question is whether you would value it as one of the two possible choices.
Yeah.
One is, of course, the regular management company. What you do is you have a maximum capacity, which is already reached. Mm-hmm. You have a revenue that you get out of those management fees, yes, and you apply DCF. That's one approach. The other approach is, since the fund has reached capacity, and there is a legal clause which can allow you to crowd out the other investors and park your own money within the fund, getting yourself the fund returns, yes, would you value the fund as the maximum of the two? And if so,
what are you building into the future that's leading you to a high value? Right now, if Renaissance charges me 2 and 20, I'm not touching the fund right now. It is not worth it. In fact, I would not do 2 and 20 with anybody in this room. I don't care how great your history is. With Renaissance, I'm not even sure I'll take 0.1, and because right now, as I said, it's a very average fund. My son works at D.E. Shaw. D.E. Shaw was special because the guy who founded David Shaw, Jeff Bezos worked at D.E. Shaw before he founded Amazon. Right? So one again, a very quant-oriented. Hedge funds, in a sense, the life cycle of excess returns has become much, much more compressed. So today, if you ask me to value Renaissance, there's no premium there. This is a very average fund. It's entirely based on assets under management and how long you can keep them, because the stickiness component comes in. So if you're a fund manager, I can't think of a single fund manager in the world that I'd pay a premium for, whereas excess returns are going to continue.
Thanks.
Professor, do you think Bitcoin is a good investor right now?
You can't invest in Bitcoin. You can only trade Bitcoin. Let me draw the contrast, right? To invest, and I know people talk about the value of Bitcoin. To value something, what do you need? You need a cash flow generating asset. You can value a stock, you can value a bond, you can value a business, because there's expected cash flows. Can you value a Picasso? No, Picassos have no cash flows. Can you price a Picasso? Yes, it's demand and supply. What determines that price? How many people think that this painting, I mean, I remember my son looking at a Picasso, this guy got the nose in the wrong place. This was when he was 8 years old. You know, he said, this guy can't paint. Thank God my son is not in charge of appraising how much you'd pay for it, you know, but as long as the demand. And I think the same response applies. Bitcoin, now in fact, I wrote a piece on breaking out every investment out there into 4 groups. You can have assets, which you can value or price, so stock, bond. You can have commodities, which generally you price, right? If I ask you, what's a value of oil or value of gold? Who really knows? You could try to build a macro model, but it's really messy, so we price. You can have a currency. You can't value currency, but we price them all the time, right? What do we call that pricing? An exchange rate. Or you can have a collectible, which you can only price. Currencies and collectibles can only be priced, they can't be valued. Any Bitcoin advocates here? I want you to put your best foot forward. What's your story for why Bitcoin is going to take over the world? One is it could be the currency of the future. There are people who believe that central banks have kind of, and I'll play devil's advocate. Let's face it, we don't trust central banks the way we might have 10 or 20 years ago. We don't trust governments, that fiat currency is something you don't want to get away from. In the old days, we didn't trust fiat currency. What did you do? You held gold. I've often described Bitcoin as millennial gold, which is you're 30 years old, you feel embarrassed holding gold because old people do it, so you hold Bitcoin instead. So it could be a collectible, or you're doing it because you think Bitcoin is a better currency. So my question with Bitcoin has always been, how good is it as a currency? That's my first question. Have any of you used Bitcoin to buy something? Nobody here has. You know what? I was at a Bitcoin conference. Don't ask me how I ended up there. I'd written a piece on Bitcoin. They thought I was an expert on Bitcoin. I said, I know nothing about Bitcoin. But these people live their lives in the Bitcoin space. So I raised this. These are all and I said, how many people? There are 1,000 people in the audience. How many people in this audience have actually used Bitcoin to buy something? There were 3 people out of 1,000 that actually used Bitcoin. Everybody traded Bitcoin, but they were, and the reason is very simple. Tomorrow, try to get your hands on some Bitcoin. Stop at that Starbucks. I saw one at the corner. Buy a venti cappuccino and offer to pay with Bitcoin. Because to complete the transaction, what does happen? 1,000 Ukrainian miners, I think they were in Ukraine, I don't know where they are now, will have to get on their computers and check a 9-number mathematical algorithm to see if you have enough Bitcoin in your pocket to buy the cappuccino. This is an incredibly inefficient way to design a currency. But there's a reason for that, right? I've also described Bitcoin as a currency created by the paranoid for the paranoid. You know when Bitcoin was born as a currency? November of 2008. It's a paper written by Satoshi Nakamoto, which we've discovered is a pseudonym for a fat guy in Cleveland living in his basement. I don't know it's not a real person. Bitcoin was born in November 2000. How many of you were in the market in November of 2008? Scary time, right? The world was melting down. And we lost trust, right? Governments, banks. It was born out of the thing, you can't trust anyone. So how did they respond to that? Bitcoin created, normally currencies, Why does people accept a $20 bill? Because the assumption is trust drives it, that there is a bank that backs it up. Bitcoin said, well, no, you can't have trust. And when you design a currency without trust, by definition, that currency is going to be inefficient. So you get this blockchain come in, and they're going to check your transactions. So Bitcoin will never be a good currency. It was never designed to be. So the currency part, I think, has been lost. Because 15 years or 16 years into Bitcoin, it's still not being used for transactions, except in El Salvador, I guess. Yeah. And that could be another story, a currency for countries where the currency is essentially, remember, fiat currencies rest entirely on trust in government. So if you're in a country where you completely lost trust, using Bitcoin. Right? Maybe Argentina will be next. I don't know, right? And, but that's not going to be a big enough market to justify paying $60,000 for Bitcoin. So I said, maybe it's the next collectible, right? Gold, think of how much money is invested in gold, and that much money went to Bitcoin. And then I said, is Bitcoin a good collectible? How do you decide whether something is a good collectible? What do good collectibles do? I'll throw in two words. During crises, which is when the collectible pays off for you, what does a good collectible do? It holds its value, right? Is Bitcoin a good collectible? How would you test that proposition? You can go back over the last 16 years. You can look at periods of crisis. Like, let's take the first 3 months of 2020. Remember the COVID crisis between February 14th of 2020 and March 23rd? Equity markets around the world lost a third of their value. This is perfect for a collectible, right? During those 6 weeks, gold held its value. It didn't go up, but it held its value. You know what Bitcoin did? It was down 58%. You come back from the crisis, stocks soar by 50%, Bitcoin is up 75%. Bitcoin has behaved like very risky stock rather than a collectible. So my question for somebody paying $62,000 for Bitcoin is, what are you buying? It's a bad currency, it's a bad collectible. There's no third alternative here. So in an indirect way, I wouldn't pay $62,000 for Bitcoin because I don't see what I'm getting in return. But if you're a trader, you can see why you'd pay $62,000, right? What do you hope to do? Sell it to somebody else at $65,000. It becomes an entirely trading game, which effectively is what it's played out over its entire life. If price is going up, the momentum carries it up. Price is going down, the momentum will carry it down. There's no anchor holding it down. With a company, at least you can say there's value here. You got to stop dropping. There is no lower bound. Let me say zero is the lower bound, I guess. And there's no upper bound. So you can say, how high can Bitcoin go? Who knows? 600,000, 800,000? It's basically pricing driving it all the way. So if anybody asks you what the value of a crypto, because remember, crypto can take lots of different forms. It can be cryptocurrency, it can be a crypto commodity. You can please lay the framework for there's a pricing for it, this is what drives the pricing, and make your best case. They can't hear you, Mike.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead. Overreact to bubbles, right? Okay. Bubbles like the .com bubble, the SEC has no role to play. My advice to regulators is let a fool and his money be parted as soon as possible. The sooner the better. I have zero sympathy for people who play bubbles because you're greedy. You live with the upside. You also have to live with the downside. So I don't think it's the SEC's role to protect people from their own greed and stupidity. I do think the SEC has to require information disclosure so you know what that is. And I don't think these bubbles were created by disclosure not being there. People just ignore the disclosures. You have a 350-page process. You know what Uber said in the original prospectus? We might never make money. Our business model doesn't work. And people bought it anyway, right? So I think first there's only a certain amount of protection you can give, and the protection has to be, we'll give you the information. If you choose to do stupid things, it's your problem. My problem with the regulators is they overreact to bubbles. Because what do they do in the aftermath of bubbles? They try to protect you from the next bubble. And in the process, they lay the groundwork for the next bubble, because what they put in as protections are actually the basis for the next bubble forming. So after bubbles, my advice to governments is do less. Don't try too hard to stop this from happening, because it will happen again. And that's why I said it's not a bad thing. If you view it as a bad thing, you view your job as a regulator to stop bubbles. The only bubbles I worry about are bubbles which create systemic costs. Banks, right? That bubble creates consequences. So if you have a sector which can create systemic risk for the rest, then I think we need, and that's why we, after the Great Depression, the reason we wrote the regulatory capital requirements is precisely to stop that. Over 100 years, it kind of lost its resonance, but we need to kind of rethink how we write those, because those bubbles create real consequences the rest of us face.
Si se quedaron con las ganas, el año que viene capaz que lo traemos de vuelta y, y hacemos otro. Thank you very much. Aswath, great conference. I think we have great things from you.